All right, looks like we're going to start. Right, so I'm here with Jeff. There he is.
Hey.
ESFP preferences on the MBTI. And we've got Ruth here, INTJ preferences on the MBTI, and me, INTP preferences on the MBTI. And so we're going to be talking about, so Jeff, if you talk about Frank and sort of like, maybe it might be good like to start from the beginning, like as you like saw Homicide, your experience of the character, and then we can sort of get into other things.
Yeah, the Homicide Life on the Street TV show started in actually January of 1993. A first episode aired after the Super Bowl that year, so it had a big initial audience, and after that struggled to retain that audience. But initially, the first episode was a hit, and the difference between Homicide and a lot of other cop shows that had aired up to that point was that, well, first of all, it was based on a book called Homicide: A Year on the Killing Streets by David Simon, he was a reporter for the Baltimore Sun, and he had actually spent a year in the Baltimore Homicide unit of the police department, sort of observing, interviewing, and just seeing how everything went and operated there, and wrote a book about it. And that book was then adapted by Barry Levinson and Tom Fontana into the TV show. And they wanted to, Fontana and Levinson wanted to stay as true to the realistic stories as they possibly could. Obviously, they still had to make it a television show, still had to get an audience. But they didn't want to do a lot of the things that were different is they didn't want to do every week wasn't going to be a bunch of chase scenes and shoot 'em up type stuff. And they didn't want every case to be solved in one episode because it was not realistic. Yes, there are some cases that actually are solved pretty quickly, but there's also a lot of ones that drag on. There's a lot of paperwork and politics involved in a lot of the way things operate. And Homicide kind of wanted to highlight some of that stuff and show, that it's not just this formulaic thing where, the detectives get somebody in a room and yell at them for a few minutes and they confess to murder, and then everybody goes home and is happy, and there was a lot more to it than that. And so anyway, I watched Homicide. I was a teenager when it first came out, just finishing up high school, or, I guess about halfway through high school, I guess, when it started. And so obviously my perspective was different then than it is now as far as watching it. But I enjoyed it, but I didn't appreciate it as much as I did later. And so as the show went on, I kind of lost interest over the last couple of seasons, especially once the Pembleton character wasn't on the show anymore because he left before the final season. But anyway, overall, I enjoyed the show a lot, and I enjoyed a lot of the different characters. But I felt a special attachment to the character of Frank Pembleton. And to me, it's a really good example because at the time when I was first watching Homicide, I didn't know anything about Myers-Briggs or personality type stuff at all. And yet I still felt a connection to Frank Pembleton. And if you look at me and you look at him, you say, oh, well, we don't look the same. We have very different backgrounds. He's from New York. He was raised in Jesuit schools. He has this, New York Jesuit upbringing, whatever you want to call it,
Yeah.
And obviously became a cop, and then eventually a detective within the police department. All these things that are not true about me. So you say, okay, well, that's not your life. Why would you relate to him? Well, I related to him for his personality in a lot of the sort of anytime there's that he sort of starts talking about his philosophy or his perspective on things, I would relate to it, including his sort of love-hate relationship with his own faith. Some of the struggles that he indicated going through were very, very similar to ones that I did. So I felt this connection with him that went so strongly to the point where there were times where a character would ask him a question or say something in response to him, and it was almost like I knew what he was going to say, which to me is like, from obviously from an outside perspective is a testament to how good the writing was in terms of consistency of the character, where not that he was formulaic or a stock character, but just that he had such a consistent character that because I was able to relate to him, it was like I knew often I was feeling and thinking the same things he was. And so I think regardless of whether the writers or producers had any specific knowledge of, 16 type theory or anything like that, or temperament theory, they knew people well enough that they could write characters that were true to life, and that they knew people that were like this. And of course, it helps when you have a book to base it on. But I know that there were plenty of things that the homicide writers, came up with themselves that weren't directly out of the book. So, but anyway, so I connected with Frank before knowing about personality type stuff, and then later on, when I rewatched the series, I got the whole series on DVD and I watched it again, myself, and then later on introducing it to my son. I then rewatched it under the perspective of the knowledge that I had gained about personality types. And then I liked it even more because some of the types became clear to me. And even the ones that were a little bit less clear, then it was kind of fun to try to figure them out, to say, well, what these particular actions or things they said, or could it be more of this motivation or this other one, or, that sort of thing. So yeah, Ben is popping up text about who Frank was based on. The name of the detective that he was most based on was a guy named Harry Edgerton. So a lot of the stuff about Frank's background came from the real background of Harry Edgerton, who was part of the Baltimore police unit. He was in fact from New York. Some of the lines in the early episodes about Pembleton were lines out of the book about Edgerton. The line in the very first episode when Felton says, he thinks he's better than us because he listens to Emmylou Harris. That was specifically one of the things that was in the book. Part of it was there was a sort of disconnect between the reason why some of the other detectives thought Pembleton thought he was better than them was that he didn't come in as a general detective on equal footing with everybody else. He actually he was working with the FBI on a particular task force. And so he spent like almost all of his time working on that and not on the regular cases in the homicide unit, which is why in the first episode, Felton makes a crack about, Frank Pembleton only works the big cases. Why this is just some dead guy. Why it's like I'm getting to work with the high and mighty Pembleton. So he's kind of razzing him about the fact that he was part of this other thing where he wasn't really part of the department the same way. So they obviously, for time reasons, probably more than anything, had to cut out the explanation of that stuff. So the audience is sort of left to kind of figure out why there's this disconnect between them. But I think the good part of that is they kind of allow it to be Andre Braugher's performance of what he gave to the personality of Pembleton, because he is so strong in his performance and the way that he portrays Frank's sort of foibles of his stubbornness and his confidence, but yet still showing his insecurities. So he comes across as a very flawed, realistic character, where he has certain things he's really good at that make him an asset to the homicide unit in terms of how he has. At the beginning, they established that basically he and Kay Howard are the two have the best track record in terms of solving cases. The two of them basically put down, as they say, more cases than anybody else. So percentage wise, when a case call comes in, one of them being the primary detective, as far as the bosses are concerned, is a good thing because they think they're going to get it solved, which is why there's a conflict right from the beginning, because of a high profile murder, or red ball as they called him, of a little girl that gets killed in the beginning, happens to be the policy was whoever answers the call is the primary detective, and it ends up being the very first case for the new detective. And so immediately the bosses want to assign it to one of the established detectives instead, because they think they're going to have a better chance of getting the case solved that way with one of them in charge. So that already sets up that conflict from the beginning of, we talked about, Ben and I talked about in the video we did about G, who was the squad commander, that he had that conflict where, you know, he didn't want to change the system and didn't want to undercut his detective. He wanted to trust him to do it, but he also knew that he was struggling with it. So anyway, the thing, one more thing I was going to say about personality wise, like I said, that I connected to Pembleton, and when I rewatched it, that there was a time for several years I had considered myself an ISFP, and it wasn't until I had, you know, several years of sort of fine tuning my stuff about myself and just learning from other people that I realized that I'm actually an extrovert. And so the funny part was that I sort of came to discovery about Frank's type at the same time I was myself. So when I originally looked at them, I would have said that Frank was an ISFP also, because I felt like, well, we're the same type. But I sort of tested that, because later on I was like, I can't remember actually whether I started to question Frank's type first or my own, because it was around the same period of time where I kind of thought, you know what, it may actually be, and I think it was a juxtaposition in the show between him and Meldrick Lewis, who I think is the ISFP. So I kind of was like, well, I'm seeing more of the contrast between them. But he also had as I was saying before, the thing with Pembleton and Felton, who I think was an ISTP, and they sort of definitely seemed like two sides of the coin on the SP scale, because they had similar approaches to life, in the sense that they're both that live in the moment, kind of solve things by your gut instinct kind of person, but what they focused on was like opposite from each other. And there's a really good scene in a third season episode where the main plot of that episode actually focuses on Kay taking a vacation and going to visit her family, and there end up being a murder she has to solve there. But meanwhile, back in Baltimore, because she's not around, her partner Felton has to work with Pembleton, and they clash about how they're looking at the case. And a lot of it has to do with Felton sort of seeing certain murders as being more important than others, because the victim is somebody that's more sympathetic in some way, or more useful to society, or some kind of somebody being more important for it. Whereas Pembleton has a very across the board, every life is important no matter what they did or who they are kind of thing. And so I think that's an example of sort of an extroverted versus introverted feeling kind of way of looking at it. So you see those two sides of the SP coin that way, in their approach to it. So anyway, so yeah, after sort of coming to the conclusion, I don't remember again if it was myself or Frank first that I came to the conclusion it's probably actually an extrovert. But then once I did, it sort of became clearer. And so I actually introduced Ben to the show Homicide by showing him the clip that I posted in the chat earlier of the time where Pembleton gets the confession out of the guy for shooting somebody they didn't really shoot. Because, and the reason that I sort of got that idea to show it to him was that somebody in the ESFP Facebook group had asked the question, could an ESFP be like a police detective or something? They may have even listed other jobs, but that was one of the things they said. And if they were, like, what would that look like? And so I was like, well, this is a perfect opportunity to post the Homicide clip. So I was like, if you look at this, the whole thing is an act. It's a performance. So you have something where you think, the ESFP is the performer type. And how would that be used as a police detective? Well, you see it in that scene. And he says in a much later scene that we'll talk about how basically his element, his sort of way, he doesn't use the term improvisation, but it's basically what it is his sort of thing that he gets this rush of is the confession, is that time in the box, as they call it, the place where they interrogate suspects. So anyway, it's a great thing because the whole thing, and you can see from the way that he suddenly he goes into this whole routine with the guy to try to connect with him and get the confession, but then he kind of switches at the end, like, you know, he's like, "You are responsible for the murder," you know, and he sounds very kind of matter of fact about it because it's like he doesn't need to keep the performance up once he has the confession. And then, so the whole thing has a lot of layers to it because the background is that, you know, he thinks that a cop shot the guy, but G doesn't want him to pursue that angle. He wants him to try to find somebody from the neighborhood. And Frank sort of says, well, you know, this is the same, that there's a racial component to this where it's like, this is what they did. Like basically when, you know, the Irish guys were in charge of the department, it was just like pin these things on the black guys. And it doesn't matter who really did it as long as we can get one of them to confess. And that's what Frank sort of uses in that scene against the guy to do exactly what he's talking about. And then he says to G at the end, you know, he would have had a better chance in the back of a paddy wagon. So he's like, he's simultaneously like moralizing on G for what he asked him to do and also bragging about his own skill of that's how good I am that I'm able to do this better than some guy who beat a confession out of him. I did it my way and it's better than that. So it's so great because it's all the elements of Frank's character where it's like he uses what he knows about the guy to make a personal connection with him, twist him all over the place, and at the same time sort of do a little bit of mocking of his own partner and his boss at the same time, and then follow it up with, you know, he still would have had a better chance if, you know, with the guys that would, you know, take him out back and beat him than he does with me. So he finds a way to like hype himself also. So all of that was just spectacular. So I thought it was a really good example of his character. Obviously, there's a lot of other elements that come up later about, you know, his history within the Catholic Church and some of the faith-based issues and things that he struggled with, and some of his inability to make friends and some of those other issues that I connected with. But that scene, and, you know, if I just have one scene to show somebody of what sort of typifies Frank, then I think that's a really good one to use. There's another one that's longer that where he is in the box with the girl that's claiming that she has multiple personalities, and one of them killed someone, and he gets her to like switch between these personalities. And at one point, one of them is like imitating everything that he says and does. So he actually takes a cigarette lighter and burns himself and gets her to do it also. So that some of the bosses think he goes too far with this. So, you know, they end up dealing with a lawsuit over that later. But it shows that aspect of sort of the SP character of doing whatever it is that you have to get the end result and using whatever elements that are at your disposal. So Frank does that really well.
Yeah, I've got that section here of Frank talking about how important it is to be able to perform in the box, the interrogation room.
Yeah, and obviously it's for anyone who hasn't seen it, a bit of a spoiler, obviously, that that Frank's character suffers a stroke, but don't have to go into detail of how any of that happens. But yeah, there's a scene in the season after that when he's still recovering from the stroke, but he's back to working cases again. But he's kind of intimidated. He's worried about his own skills in the box and with suspects because that's what he was best at, like I said earlier. So when he's talking about this, because he's doubting his skills in that area, it makes him overall not as good a cop, and you know, and in his life he feels like he's sort of caught in between. So he says, you know, my old life hangs over me. But he's talking about that he wants it to be one way or the other. Either have his entire ability to, you know, be in the box and get somebody, you know, because he feels that rush from it or whatever, but so he feels like he can't fully be himself. But then he also, the stroke didn't make it so he couldn't remember that. It didn't knock out his ability to feel those things or remember them. So he has this sort of caught in between feeling, like I can't, I want it to be one way or the other. Either I can fully recover, I can live my life the way I did before, or this, I'm debilitated where I can't do any of this stuff, or I don't remember any of this stuff, because then I don't feel like I'm missing anything. But yeah, this is a good, talking about the rush is a thing I kind of have to try to explain to people when I'm sort of explaining the SP artisan mentality, that sort of all of life is a series of those things, the experience being what it is, and it's different things to different people. So he's pointing out, he lists two specific things. He says better than nicotine, better than caffeine, because he's saying things that some people use to get their rush from, and obviously things that he has used himself, but he's saying this is better than that because it's sort of more unique to him. It's something where he's actually can use a skill as opposed to it just being ingesting something. Like, that's never going to be as good as something where he's used his skill and ability to get this confession from someone, to get to the truth from somebody.
Right then. So, what do you think I should show next? Oh, Jeff, there's that scene in the first episode, the keys scene, which is slightly emblematic of, if that's the right word, of his character. I'm prepared to accept better words than emblematic.
Yeah, so the basic gist of it is that he has... They have this system because they use... they don't. Each cop doesn't have their own car. They have cars that are sort of used by everybody, and they just take whatever the next one is. And so what they're supposed to do is, when they take the car out, when they have the key, they're supposed to write down on their sheet or whatever the number of the car so that they get the right key, because the cars themselves are not numbered. So he forgot to write it down the last time, so he has to go around the parking garage trying every car to see which one the key fits. And Felton tries to get him to go get another key that they know the number of, so they can just go ahead and take it. But he refuses to do that. He insists on finding that car. He's so determined to do that, and he's stubborn about the way. And so Bo keeps saying, like, let's just go back upstairs. And he, with a scene, when he holds it up, he says, "I am not going upstairs." And then the funny part is he doesn't end up finding it, because they end up getting a call, or Howard and Bayless are going to another thing, and they decide to go with him. So he doesn't even end up finding it. Another thing I thought was great about the show, because it's that whole thing where they don't do the tacked on happy ending thing where everything always has a resolution. You see that in both drama and comedy shows. Comedy, usually it's because it's just the joke, so they'll bring the resolution for the comedy of it. In drama shows, it's like, again, it's maybe they'll try to sort of encapsulate it. Some of it was just convenience for networks to have, well, you can see this show anytime in any order with syndication or whatever, and it's going to make sense, as opposed to having to have seen the previous episode or anything like that. Episodic shows were generally easier to sell for those reasons, but they never wanted it to be. And Homicide didn't always have, something where it was like a continuing story through every episode, but they did have continuing things that went throughout. So even if there were new cases in a show, it wasn't as cut and dried as like, oh, this show introduced this case and then they solved it by the end of the episode. There were some that they did, but not as much as a lot of other cop shows. But
Jeffy says something in that scene with Felton in the garage. He says there's something that struck me as quite artisan, where it's going to be the next car. How do you know it's going to be the next? It's almost like maybe that's an artisan thing of like, maybe it's the next one. Or
Yeah.
is there some truth to that, Jeff?
Yeah, I think so. Sort of that thing Kersey said about like about luck and sort of the funny thing is I remember on a type forum, I think it was, I can't remember now if it was Personality Cafe or Typology Central, but one of them I asked about that, and most of the SP people didn't want to characterize it that way. They wanted to, they'd rather characterize themselves as being realistic, but they would still talk about it as if it's like, well, you know, the odds are if you have failed 3 times in a row or whatever, you'll get it on the 4th one. It's sort of like, I can't remember exactly how it was put, but it was sort of the same thing, just under different different terms.
I think it's a bit of I think it's a bit of the, because I think that artisans like to gamble, and part of it is like, oh, next one I'll strike it rich. I'll like,
yeah, it's kind of like, okay,
jackpot.
if a result is guaranteed, something can still be fun, but if it's riskier, then it's more fun if there's a payoff to it. So because when you have something that's riskier, then you can have a harder fall, but you also have a higher climb. So it's sort of like there's more. It feels more rewarding if you accomplish it. You know, that's why something like in sports where, you know, they'd have like a team that, you know, knocks off all of the number one teams to get to the top, has that more satisfying feeling than if they played lesser teams. You know, if it was just luck of the draw, they'd never played the best teams, then everybody's going to constantly sort of try to put an asterisk on it, like, well, yeah, you won the championship, but you didn't have to play the best team to get there, you know. And they don't want that. They want to say, look, we knocked off all of the top people and did it that way.
Right. And I think that Frank will be prepared to go longer because it's Pembleton. No, because he wants to prove Felton wrong. Is the person like, it's not only would it be the car, but it would also, see, I told you.
Yeah, exactly. He wants to show him up. So there's
that
happens between those two quite a few times during the years that they're on the show together, because they sort of have this thing where it's this animosity, but it's not really like a deep personal animosity. They really don't hate each other, but they have this thing where any opportunity to sort of show the other one up and be like, hey, I did this better, you know, they take that opportunity. So that's the thing, is there's a sort of form of respect there. That's another one thing that I try to explain to people is if you don't have any respect for the other person, then you don't bother to do that, and it's not as enjoyable. Whereas the competition is better if you actually respect the opponent, if you have some sort of feeling of camaraderie with them, as opposed to it just being, I really can't stand this person, because the people that you can't stand, you don't want to spend time with, period.
I think that's true for, say, ESFP and for mature ESTPs. The idea of respecting the opponent, because there are some ESTPs that are just cocky and they will just act like it's just like somebody to bully to make them look good, or because they're bored. But I can also see that in the mature ESTP that does respect the opponent.
Yeah,
and you see that sometimes
factors in, I think, and I don't think that's just I don't think it's a TF thing. I mean, ESFPs can act the same way. It just kind of depends on, you know, a lot of things. But yeah, I think the maturity level comes in just sort of recognizing that respect that's involved. I think probably even at a young age, we do that. It's just not aware of why, not as self-aware.
Right. I suppose instinctive, which is something I sort of like reframe things as. There's like a guardian instinct and an artisan instinct. So
I think in the early years of the show, they were kind of trying to establish Frank as, you know, he's this skilled detective. He gets cases solved, but he's kind of a loose cannon in a way, like he sort of has his own way of doing things, and he doesn't like to be questioned or have people get in his face about the way he's doing things, because his attitude is, if I'm solving the cases, then don't bother me about how I'm doing it. And of course, at the very beginning, he says he doesn't need a partner. And the reason is not because originally that's one of those things where you could say, oh, he's introverted because he wants a partner, he wants to work alone. But it's not really about that. It's about he doesn't want his methods questioned or messed with. He doesn't want someone to like ruin his flow because he has a way he wants to solve the case. And he feels like if I'm on this role of I'm getting this thing, I don't want somebody else coming in there and messing it up.
Oh, so I remember, Jeff, that I liked it when in the series there would be someone in there at his level, like this guy, this older guy, the Araba, would. But some people might not know what that means. Somebody who sells vegetables on the back of a horse and cart, and I think that's what it means. Anyway, so he was able to like go toe to toe with Frank, and there was that bit where like he was like criticizing him for being a sort of like an educated, aloof black man, and then there was also a thing where you had Alfre Woodard, who was in Star Trek First Contact, and she played she played a character that was at the same level.
Yeah, I almost asked you
good head-to-head scenes.
We were talking about. I was trying to find stuff from the earlier years, because you were saying that you had the screenshots from the later seasons. So that one was in the 6th season episode called Mercy. But yeah, I figured you'd bring that up because that's a good example of sort of where somebody improved his skills by sort of matching him, as opposed to being somebody he could just sort of railroad over because they were dumb, and he could convince them to say they did anything. The scene I talked about earlier was kind of in between, because he had a guy that was not a complete idiot, but he played on his emotions about the friend that he lost. So he still found a way to manipulate him, whereas with the woman you're talking about that Alfre Woodard played, he didn't really have either angle, because she was not only an intelligent woman, but very cool and collected and sure of herself. So he wasn't going to say something like that triggered her emotions in a way where she was going to break down because of him. She could, give as well as she got, as they say.
Oh, there's sometimes
there was another guy like that, Gordon Pratt, the guy that was accused of shooting the detectives.
The phony.
Yeah, well, that they had to find a way to use his own sort of ego against him. So it still was sort of an emotional manipulation, but it was more once they found something where he took pride in that they could sort of poke a hole in, then they were able to break that down.
Right.
But he still didn't confess.
Yeah. There's a thing where it was slightly brought up where there was things about an issue about a woman with multiple personalities, and he arguably trying to seduce her. And there was like an internal thing about, was that ethical about what he did? And that might say something about utilitarian tactics.
Yeah, the one I talked about earlier with where he at one point used a cigarette lighter. And yeah, he did. He tried several methods because she had the different personalities. So he tried to use whatever he could in each one of those.
Right.
And he wasn't sure at first. Like, G immediately says he thinks she's faking it. Russert thought she wasn't, and Frank was sort of in between. So again, showing that artisan mentality, it's like it doesn't really matter whether it's fake or not. He sort of believes that if it is, he's going to get her to break out of it. But if it's not, it doesn't matter as long as he gets to what he's trying to get to. So he'll use either way, which I think is sort of the way that we approach things when it comes to people's personas, because there are people that focus on that one way or the other. Their whole point is trying to like break someone's persona down. Whereas my attitude is sort of like, if somebody wants to portray themselves a certain way, then essentially that is how they are, to the extent that they're doing that. So I sort of take people as they present themselves because I don't trust people anyway. So I'm not going to, just because someone presents themselves a certain way, I'm not going to go all in and believing everything they say just because they do that. So for me, there's not as much risk involved in me accepting someone for what they present, because I'm not giving them a bunch of trust because of that. I'm just allowing themselves to present themselves that way. So it's not important to me to like show someone has, phoniness or anything like that. Like the lack of authenticity is not as important to me as it is what's the practical effect of whatever it is they're doing.
Right. Right then. So, one of the things I'd like to say in terms of one of the ways in which he busts the stereotype is besides the fact that it's that thing of you've got a character doing an atypical thing, but in a typical way, in the way he goes about the job, or the aspects of the job that he finds particularly attractive. And to him, it is that one there that we went over before about being inside the box, and also that idea of the rush, the artisan being the sensation-seeking personality.
Yeah, and there's a funny scene between him and Kellerman, the ESTP detective, because Kellerman is basically trying to assert that Pembleton doesn't know how to have fun. That he's too wrapped up in his work. So Kellerman starts talking about things that are fun for him, that are like sort of adrenaline-inducing, whatever. And he lists these things, and then, that gives you this feeling of enjoying the moment or whatever. I can't remember exactly how he puts it, but Frank goes, "Oh, you mean work?" Because to him, like, he gets that out of his work, because this is, he's what he's talking about in this quote is that's the thrill that he gets, is that he uses those skills and stuff. So he gets a rush out of doing his job in that part of it. It doesn't mean his entire job. It's funny because he frames it as that's work, but then the part of his job that don't involve that, he doesn't enjoy at all. Like he doesn't like sitting there doing paperwork and all those kind of things. Like he slacks off on those things. And so what he gets held to task with by G and other bosses is when the things he does that are not by the book. And, for him, for instance, he's always late, which they talk about after he has the stroke and he comes back, they're talking about, how he's late and Lewis, I think he was always late. So that nothing changed there.
He's also a bit of like, there's that element of Frank where he's like a bit elitist in that he's also a bit of a Dapper Dan. Like, and there was even an episode early on where Giardello usually wants all of his detectives to wear ties, and it was a really hot night on a night shift, and he really wanted Frank to take his tie off.
Yeah,
he was annoyed by how
another one of those
was under pressure.
Another one of those cases, like the thing with the conversation with him and Kellerman, is that he's sort of messing with him. Once he realizes that this is this thing that's bothering G, then he's all the more determined to leave the tie on.
At one point, I would have put in the script, straighten the tie up.
And I've said that so many times with my son, because he has this jacket that he wears all the time, whether it's hot or cold. And even when it's cold, he doesn't zip it up. But when it's hot, he doesn't take it off. So he always has the jacket on, but not zipped up all the time, no matter what the weather is. And there's times in which it's been like super hot. I mean, I live in Texas, and it gets, there's times it's like pushing 110 degrees, and he'll still have the jacket on. And as we were leaving for somewhere, when he has the jacket on, I'll say, "Take that tie off, Frank." Because that's exactly what it makes me think of.
Right, so this is my friend Faye the ENFJ.
Hi.
Own channel. What else was I going to bring up about Frank? I've lost it. It was a little bit about little things where his temperament comes through, where he meant to be going somewhere, decides to have a basketball game with Darth Vader's voice. James Earl Jones.
Yeah.
Just doing something on the spur of the moment. What else was there? There was particular issues with him. Oh yeah, so that's what I was going to say. Yes, so he's part of, because this goes into his. I think this is a factor in his social extroversion, especially in comparison with the character of Lewis. So Lewis is from the community. He's from the housing projects, and so you could say that it's much easier for Lewis to communicate with the people of Baltimore, where they usually have crimes. Where it's because he sort of speaks their language. And I think Jeff said that the actor in real life, Clark Johnson, he talks more in that. He didn't use the term, but it was like something like the American theatre standard, sort of like more theatrical kind of voice in real life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But Lewis, it's more of the how can I put this? African American vernacular English for, say, Lewis, whereas Pembleton is a lot more elitist and educated sounding in his vocabulary, and use words like contusion and purloined, things like that. And when you do see him socializing with his wife, you get the idea that it's with sort of like the upper middle class, in the upper black middle class in Baltimore. And so he knew that James Earl Jones character in Homicide. And so it's like, he also at one point he knew the police chief. And there was a little bit of and the police chief wanted to promote him, but he wanted to there was some shenanigans going on there. Was that Al Freeman Jr. guy, Jeff? The one that played the higher up police chief kind of guy? So it's like he had this idea that sort of Frank was sort of moving in these upper circles, and so that even though he's an extrovert, he doesn't want to socialize with these other people, because he's got this sort of upper crust, so to speak, people that he sort of socializes with off camera. And also he spends most of his time with his wife. But then, you see what I mean? I think it was on a behavior level.
I wouldn't
Lewis
say
is more
that he's elitist. I would say, as I said earlier, the other detectives sort of projected that onto him, because he did have confidence and he did have an ego, and I think they sort of assumed an arrogance to him, that he thought he was better than them, and I think that's another way I related, and because I've had some people who have projected that on me, where just because egotism is just you're good, but it's different than arrogance, because arrogance is believing somehow that makes you better, you're some sort of higher scale of being. And I don't think that he thought that any more than I do. It really seemed like he knows he's good at what he's good at and doesn't want to be questioned in that area. And he doesn't fall for excuses. You were talking about sort of the attitude he had with the community. I think it's because, and he sort of talked about this with Lewis in at least one episode, that his attitude was that, no matter where somebody comes from, they can choose to make the right choices. They can educate themselves. They can get out of circumstances or places where they have bad influences and that are leading them to commit crimes or things. He believed very much an individual, can pull themselves out of that situation, whereas Lewis would basically sort of say, look, people are more of a product of their environment, as opposed to it being, he would kind of say, well, Frank, it's not as easy for some people, as you think, because of he would try to allege it's like where you came from, like you were saying earlier with the Araber, in the Adina Watson case. He made that assumption, you're this guy, this New York guy who doesn't understand what it's like here, so you can't understand. And Frank's attitude was, more universal, like we're all sort of human beings. We have the same problems regardless of where we came from. So I don't think he looked at himself as an elitist, and I didn't really see him that way either. I think it wasn't as important to him to belong to a so-called community as it was to have his individual freedoms and choices. And that sort of led to him having less friends. And he talked about that with Bayless, about how he wasn't good at making friends. And part of it was the perception people had of him that he didn't want to. They thought that, and he talked about even the time where he said when he went to the bar, and everybody made a big deal about how he doesn't come to the bar and hang out with us. And he did that time. And he said, part of the reason I don't is because everybody makes a big deal about it. It's like this thing where, you sort of and I relate to that so much because I had that happen so much growing up, where there's situations where I like attention, but it's like the more that people want me to do something, the less that I want to do it. So if you make it into this big deal where it's like, oh, you have to do this thing, and then it becomes like an obligation and an expectation as opposed to just this thing you're going to casually decide to do. So yeah, I definitely think there were some aspects of that in Frank too.
Yeah, I do think that it's a lot of his. I mean, I don't know the hours they work, but it's like, he doesn't get to see much of his wife anyway. And I do think a big part of it is like, because like we got that idea that like I said, that I think he moves in different circles, and he might not necessarily. I mean, there are some people who are like, well, I see these people at work all day. I don't want to see them again after work. And then there's other people who want to see the same people all again.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember that I did a couple of videos with the guy that's a minister, Franklin Ruff.
Yeah, he was brilliant, ISTJ guy. Yeah,
yeah, and he said something I thought was really interesting, because he talked about how people at work, I think this was talking about before he was a minister. He worked in an office or something like that. Anyway, he said that there were people that wanted him to come to social events that were the people he worked with were invited to. And he said something about like, basically like, you don't have a right to my personal time. That's not exactly the words used, but it was something along those lines. I thought it was really interesting that he sort of compartmentalized. It's like, you have my attention as my work time, and then my personal life, like you're not authorized for this time. Like that's for something else, So whereas I really don't divide things as much that way. If I've got somebody, probably more than not of the people that I've hung out with in my life outside of work have in fact been people that I met at work. It's just an easy place to meet people. So I'm not going to make that a divide where I'm like, oh no, you're work people, you have to be separate from my personal life. Now there are some differences in the way I behave, which have kind of shocked some people that I worked with, because when they only saw me in work mode and then they saw me outside of work, there have been people that have been taken aback by certain things I've said or done, because my work version of myself is very restrained, sort of to fit into the expectations of the workplace and keeping a job for as long as I have. You kind of have to. Those of us who have a little bit more, I don't know, just say goofy personalities, like we have to kind of hold some of that in order for people to not just think we're completely insane.
Yeah, because I think you said that your job is sort of like better suited for an ISTJ.
Well,
a lot of it is like
itself, yeah, the work itself, that's definitely true. So I have to find other ways to enjoy my work. So I would still say probably more of a I don't know, saying more of a personality doesn't really sound right, because that sounds like I'm discriminating, like saying an ISTJ can't have a personality or something. That's not what I'm saying, but I guess I'm just, I'm goofier and more like, with more of a variety of things I do or say than, say,
Yeah.
maybe an ISTJ would in the same position.
But-
But yet I still am very restrained from how I am outside of work.
And the weird thing is that the older ISTJs can get really like an inner ENFP and have like these weird moments where they're like really quite eccentric as they get older. So ISTJs over 50 can have some quite interesting personalities.
Well, before you mentioned, I guess, reading something from some description of ESFPs or whatever, and finding things that Frank did that were part of that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you still wanted to do that, but
yeah. Do you want to go through the step 2 first, or go straight to the description?
I mean, I don't know. When you say go through, I don't know if there's something specific you wanted to relate to Frank from that or not. But
yeah, so maybe like in terms of these scales of extroversion, where do you think Frank would score?
I guess I'm going to have to do that thing you recommended and maximize the screen so I can actually read it.
Yeah. Oops. Yeah, there should be a little box once it's there. There should be a little box in the bottom left that looks like the maximize symbol that you get near a YouTube video.
I found it.
Oh yeah, sorry, I'll just get there. There we go.
So already we talked a little bit about how, in terms of how Frank appears to other people, probably more people, he would probably, on that expressive versus contained thing, he'd probably be more to the contained side than I am. But as I've said before, some people would think I would be more to that side than I am, according to this. So it kind of, the perception is not always different not always the same as self-perception, but we were kind of talking about the gregarious versus intimate part. There's one other reason why eventually I was convinced that he is an extrovert, is that I don't think he specifically sought one-on-one as being superior to groups. It was just sort of, again, a product of circumstance and the fact that he has a tough time sort of making friends with people. So just sort of by nature, he ends up in more on one-on-one situations, like with his wife and with Bayless and the people that really know him very well, or at least better than anyone else does. It would be interesting to see, if you could have the character fill this out, how it would end up. But I would expect probably more out of preference indicators than mine. But I don't know, because I know, again, if you had somebody else fill this out for me, based on what they know of me, they might have me more on that side too. It's funny because whichever one I claim to be, there was always people trying to talk me into the other one. Because back when I was identifying as ISFP, there were people always on like type forums and stuff saying they thought I was an extrovert. And initially I resisted that. Again, part of it just out of my own stubbornness, but I also thought, well, I know myself better, and I also confused social awkwardness and some amount of shyness with introversion, because they're not really the same thing. So it was sort of easy for me to use that as a scapegoat. You're like, oh, well, the reason why I haven't had many friends and I don't meet people well, whatever, it's because I'm an introvert. But the reality is that would have bothered me less if I really was an introvert, because I wouldn't have felt that need for more people. But Frank expressly, in at least one episode, tells Bayless that he's wrong, because Bayless thinks he doesn't want to be friends with anyone, and Frank basically tells him, no, that's not true. He does want more friends. He just doesn't. He's never been good at making friends. He doesn't, for whatever reason, he says something, or he doesn't say the right things to sort of connect with people or bring them in. So he feels more confident at work doing his job because he feels like he's in his element and he can use those skills that he has. So the extroversion skills come out more in his work than they do in his personal life.
There's also a thing in the American like detective things that's going way back decades that the detective has a poor private life because they put it all into their job, and they have like addictions, smoking, alcohol, those sort of things.
So you have sort of irony. The reason why I sort of I contrasted him with Lewis is that you have both of them sort of seeking the opposite of what ends up happening because of their circumstances. Lewis is friendlier, but actually does prefer more of the one-on-one interactions with people, and ends up sort of being thrown into situations where he's got more of a group. And so he sort of adapts to that, whereas it's the opposite with Frank, where it's sort of like he really would like to have more friends and more group activity, but he doesn't really do it very well. So he ends up in the situations just one-on-one, and he's adapted to that. So you have both of them have some struggles in their personal life because of that. And both of them end up having trouble with their respective marriages. You know, Lewis is obviously doesn't last very long at all. And Frank has some struggles with that, where his wife leaves him for a period and all that. So they both have sort of their struggling with circumstances versus preferences.
Right. There's nothing really on here. Maybe you could say with Lewis that he's sociable with a lot of people in order to find that one. And also for a lot of the series, he was single, so he might have been like casting a wide net.
Yeah, and he wants, you notice in the partnerships that Lewis has, he wants to have more of he wants to be friends with his partner and have like a more strong tie to his partner, whereas Frank comes off as caring less about that. Like, even of course at the beginning he said he didn't want a partner at all, but then later on it's sort of like he wants he's a little more aloof seeming with the relationship. And this is another thing that I've seen that sort of is a misconception, I think, with extroverts, is there's this sort of attitude of, oh, extroverts have a lot of friends, so that means it's easy for them to make friends. And the reality is it's more like a lot of acquaintances, because sort of our natural personality, we end up in situations where we know, quote unquote, a lot of people, but don't really know them well. It's just sort of like casual acquaintance. Whereas introverts tend to form tighter, closer bonds with individuals. It may be less people overall, but it's like a more tight friendship or relationship. And so you see that with Lewis in terms of he really takes it personally, like all the things the links he goes to with what happened after Cressetti died, and then how he was with Kellerman. It's like really important to him to have this strong bond with his work partner, and it not just to be about that. Whereas with Frank, and to another extent with Kellerman, you don't see that as much. It's not, that particular aspect is not as important to them, because they're not, that one-on-one bond is not quite the same. And again, it's hard to tell where the line is between preference and circumstance, because sometimes it's sort of easy to fall into something and it becomes such a habit that you could turn around retroactively and say that was the preference of the person, but it may not really be.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so Ruth, does that sort of ring true for you in terms of how you view socializing with people?
So the question would be, would I prefer having fewer, stronger friendships than a large circle?
Yeah, I think I know the answer.
Yes, absolutely. But I think that would be probably typical of introverts, because just the propensity for meeting people is going to be limited. For like extroverts would want to meet more people in the first place.
I think we have a higher bar for people, especially the ITs. I think
Well, have you seen, though, this is interesting, I think I could ask both of you, though, have you encountered people that you either pretty sure or at least suspect are extroverted, where they sort of lament that to you, where you might look at them and say, well, they've got more people they know, but they kind of say, well, I sort of envy the way that you have like a stronger connection with your friends, even if it's less of them, but you're tighter with them than I am.
Also, it might be the case that there's probably a lot of extroverts out there, especially if they're feeling types, who do have like close connections with people, and it's like probably have like lots of varying kinds of relationship. You know, they're still going to have their sort of inner circle because they've got like a lot of people to choose from. In terms of, like, you know what I mean? Because they're in contact with so many people that they might be able to find those particular people within that who are, even if it's just 10%, where they have a really close.
Yeah, I'm sure there's some that do. I certainly wouldn't try to say that there's no extroverts that have close friends, but it's just sort of again, I think it's more of a habit. Like, I feel like for me, I've said many times, and maybe this is just me, seeing it through my own lens, I don't know, but I feel like I'm always the one who has to try to keep friendships going. It seems like there's been people that I've lost touch with, and it seems like when that happens, it's because I stopped putting forth an effort, but I'm always the one who had to. Like, people don't go out of their way to contact me or stay in contact with me. I have to be the one that does it, or else we lose touch. And that can gets tiresome after a while.
Yeah.
I feel like if it's really a friendship's important to somebody, then it should be a two-way street, and they should be reaching out to me sometimes, not waiting for me to do it.
I've always thought this is a bit dodgy, like putting resourceful in imaginative. There's loads of sensing people who are resourceful. In fact, I could argue that a lot of sensing people in certain ways are much more resourceful than intuitive people. So
yeah,
I think
maybe thoughtful would have been a better word. I don't know. I'm not sure what they were really going for there, but
because I would say imaginative is I would break it down like this: introverts more imaginative, extroverts creative. But again, it's something that's sort of independent of type, because I think any type can be creative in their own way, and it's just that guardians tend to not going to seek it out as a career in the main. They'll have hobbies, like you can have ISFJs that write poetry.
Well, we've talked about before how some of these things, when you just go by the letter dichotomy and you ignore temperament, then you kind of lump people together that don't necessarily fit. Like putting seek efficiency as a sensing trait. Honestly, I think NTs as a temperament seek efficiency more than anyone else.
Yeah, and you could argue STJs seek efficiency, but for them, it's the efficient way is to do it by the book. But that's a different kind of efficiency.
It's like, I think about my brother, and like so much of his approach to even things like adventure video games. It's like, what's the most efficient way to beat this game?
Right. Okay, so it's like I've sort of mentioned this before. Like, there's like three kinds of efficiency, like the in general, and it's usually amongst the thinking types, where it's like the STP efficiency, which is like the quickest, most expedient solution. Then there's like the STJ efficiency, which is like, well, if you do it by the book, you won't go wrong and get yourself into problems. And so by avoiding problems safely but surely, that's efficient to them. And then the NTJ is like efficient but like more strategic. So it's like three kinds of efficiency. And they would all argue that they're all being efficient.
My ISTJ coworker that was talking recently about how he read a book by Warren Buffett about something about investing and the different, the most important principles of investing or something like that. And he said, I had to stop from just laughing out loud when he said it, because he said And the one that he listed that I thought was most important was wait.
I like how when you did his voice, you sort of flattened it a bit.
Yeah, I'm like, of course you thought that was the most important.
Yeah.
That's like his philosophy on everything. Wait.
And
which is the complete opposite of my ESTP coworker, who it's like when you ask him or tell him that you need to do anything, it's like he physically is incapable of waiting. He has to immediately whip out his cell phone and call whoever it is that he's supposed to be telling something. Before you've finished what it is that you need to tell him, he's got the phone out and is already calling them, because it's like must be done right this second. But yeah, on this section, that's the one where I said, again, that Frank and I may have that in common, because the questioning, precise, challenging, want discussion versus approving, agreeable, want harmony. That definitely seems like it fits Pembleton. And it seems like that's something that is a very common thing in somebody in a job like that. You know, not necessarily a police detective, but any job where you do have to question people, that's part of what you're doing, then you need to have that be something that, you know, you have at least some preference for, because you develop that skill for it. If your entire goal is accommodation, then you're probably not going to be real good at that. You know, diplomacy is one thing, like obviously working in an actual job where you're trying to negotiate or mediate between people, then it's very helpful to have you know, skills in that area. But you know, when you're sort of like any job where you've got to question someone to get to an end result, you know, then that's going to come out strongly. And obviously, I think it comes out in Frank.
Yeah, it's just that something that Kersey would talk about, like the directive and the informing roles. And being a detective is a little bit like being an inspector, to such an extent that in England, the detectives are called inspectors. So you've got the television series that called Inspector Morse.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's one of those directive roles. And even with the when they're talking to the public, they have to be a little bit firm. Like, just the facts, ma'am. It's like, so they can't be like overly friendly, and it's like sticking to the facts.
Yeah. And well, this reminds me, I was going to say that again, I gave you a link to that where I think somebody wrongly typed Bayless, but they did at least make a case for why, but I think they got a couple of things majorly wrong. And one of them is just the general sense that I still don't think typing by functions is a good way to do it, because it ignores the actual aspects of practical, how personality shows and temperament side of things. But even setting that aside, I think this person sort of missed the boat on some of that stuff. But if someone were to do something like that with Frank, sort of a drive-by typing of him, they might think he was a thinking type, because they talk about him as being like this cerebral, you know. I think he may even be referred to as like the thinking man's detective or something. Somebody says something like that at some point. And they contrast him with Bayless, like Bayless is quote unquote the sensitive one, you know. And so in that dynamic, you might say, oh, well, Frank's the thinker and Bayless is the feeler. The reality is, in terms of personality types, in terms of Myers-Briggs, I think they're both feelers. But as I said before, Bayless is in function terms the extroverted feeler, and Frank the introverted feeler.
Yeah, but I do think
in that come out in terms of Frank shows his compassionate side in a lot of areas, and and part of the reason he is able to do that emotional manipulation thing is he is able to connect with people on an emotional level. He is able to sort of have some empathy and sort of see where they're coming from, and be gentle when he needs to be, to sort of get to know someone well enough to know what will work when he's trying to, you know, get information from them, as opposed to it being just a very hard-nosed approach.
Yeah, and so there was that storyline where there was a kid, and it was like he killed somebody, and he thought, well, you know, he thought that because he didn't mean to kill him, and it was an accident, that he wasn't really in trouble, because like he killed someone but didn't mean to do it. And then when he actually gets sentenced, and Frank gives him his telephone number, and says that whilst he's in prison, if you want to call me, you can call me. So it's like he had that compassion for this younger kid killer. Who was about 13, 14 years old.
Yeah.
At the time.
And then he had the episode where it was the young girl that had killed her stepfather, I believe it was, who had been abusing her mother. And Frank sort of tried to lead her in the direction of saying it was self-defense because he really thought, that she shouldn't be held accountable the same way. And so you saw him sort of reaching out to her in a way, and then subsequently to Bayless, because Bayless in that instance was sort of taking the opposite side, because as someone who had been abused himself, he was sort of projecting his own insecurities because he wasn't able to stop the abuse. And Frank has to actually say he's talking about the mother and the daughter, and he says the sin is not their own. And then he very pointedly says to Bayless while looking at him, the sin is not your own. And so he has that moment where it's like he's obviously trying to reach out to Bayless and show that tenderness and not have him continue to be torn up by this from his own experience. And that, of course, is, again, what leads to, after that, Bayless goes to the uncle that abused him and actually starts taking care of him. But
with when we did because we have reviewed all the episodes, folks, one of the themes would come up would be like in comparing Frank with Lewis, especially when it came to sort of ethics, in that Lewis would really like stick to it a lot more. Like once he got a chip on his shoulder, he would like carry through on it. But with Frank, it seemed to be these things where, like, yes, he had these strong opinions about things, but other times he would sort of like let it go, and it was like,
yeah, he's a little less controlled by that, which I think is to the extent I always say that you can't really observe functions the way some people seem to think you can. And you can't really know like what's a lead function versus a secondary thing, because it's like so many things are sort of combinations of factors.
yeah,
And it's not like there's some percentage that you can see in action. Oh, they went 30% to this or 30, but over time you can observe sort of what the focus is. And in contrasting those characters, there's two main things I think of for where Lewis's ethics, he drew the line in the sand where this was just not going to be passed. And the first one was in the episode where Felton had tried to look the other way on the guy that had shot his father because his father was in pain.
Not just look the other way, but actually tell him to like wash his hands. So he passed the test.
So let him get away with it. And Lewis has this, great line where he says, "You go when it's your time to go, and anything else is homicide." So that's a defining ethic for Lewis, where it doesn't change what the circumstances, no matter what the circumstances are. And the other one is later on after he gets suspended from the force, and he goes on what I think I described as an FI crusade.
Yeah.
Because he personally becomes this sort of vigilante detective taking down the people in the drug organization. And so he
definitely, it was their time to go.
Yeah. So he sets these things up where he doesn't do them himself, but he sets other people up. But it's because he believed that was more important. He wasn't doing it for fun. He was doing it because, he thought that was the most important thing, and he was going to bring it about by any means necessary. So that's where you really have those, the artisan temperament and the deep feeling function come together, where you have somebody that is willing to bend the rules, but in the pursuit of an ethical principle.
Yeah,
not
because it was
for his
like,
own pleasure.
it's just that in a lot of speeches when we would talk about this, when Frank would have a speech, and it was like, you think that he was like going on like making a strong ethical point, but then it was like, oh, that was just something that was in the moment. But I think there's
he's
less
very
of
matter
that.
of fact about it. You know,
Yeah.
he's sort, and again, that goes back to the performance aspect. That's the thing. It's like,
Yeah.
he enjoys hearing himself talk, and I relate to it so much because it just, some people laugh at it, but it's like when you're on a roll talking about whatever, if it happens to be something that is an ethical subject, then I can still get enjoyment out of sort of the talking about it. And that's more important than the actual subject. In terms of my enjoyment level, it's about the fact I was able to sort of hold court on a particular thing.
Yeah. It's about
That's more
expressing
important
himself.
or more enjoyable for me than any kind of, I was talking about this earlier today, that more so than getting someone to agree with me. That's not really the important part. And if you notice, there are a few times, even when Frank is arguing with somebody, sometimes it's Bayless, but not always, that they end up sort of agreeing with him, and then he's actually irritated that
Yes.
they agree with him. He's like, you're not supposed to agree with me. We're doing this give and take thing. Like, I wasn't trying to convince you of anything.
Yeah, it's almost like he's using, for lack of a better phrase, he wants to extrovert his feeling. He's being creative with it. It's just like we said with ESFP, is where they're like, when they're holding court and they're holding the attention of other people, they're using extroverted feeling in the sense of being expressive and playing to the crowd. It's sort of an unvalued way. And just like him, like say, just like getting on the flow of expressing, say, an ethical thing and putting it out there. And part of it is putting it out there in the right way, being persuasive with it.
There's a great scene, and I don't know, I can't remember if we talked, if you ever watched Night Court, but the character, the bailiff Roz, there's this great scene where basically this teenager has like held them up, and she's gotten him to let the rest of them go, but he still has the gun, and she basically kind of talks him down into turning himself in and not like going to this life of crime. Or she shows him compassion, but it's like she gets wrapped up in the adrenaline of this situation, and the way she deals with it is she's talking about how he's supposed to be this stick-up guy, and he's like, she says something like, that you're not a professional or something, and he's like, how do you know that? And she's like, well, because has seen already that he has this bag, this Fritos sticking out of his jacket, and he says something about who holds up a, risks his life or whatever, and all he scores is a lousy bag of Fritos. And then she pauses and goes, and then the chili kind. I hate the chili kind. It's like there's no reason for her to even say that, but it's just she's wrapped up in that adrenaline of the moment, and it's like just rub it in. You focus on this thing that you observed, sensingly. However, that's not really a word, but you know what I mean. Yeah. Used your senses, picked up the Fritos, point to that, focus on it, and then use it. It's exactly what.
Yeah, because it's just in there in the moment, and you have a strong opinion, and it's like one of these quirky character things. It's like, if you've got a strong opinion about it and it's there, and it didn't sound, in that example you gave, it didn't sound like it was crowbarred in for comedic effect. It had the ring of truth to it.
Right, yeah.
It's just a quirky moment from a character.
Yeah. So when you have that combination of a character being written consistently and a good actor who has played the part long enough, especially, then you get those great scenes where everything comes together. And you have, from the very first episode with Andre Braugher playing Pembleton, the character itself had to take a little time to be established. In the first episode, he's more established by people talking about him than what he actually does. He doesn't actually appear for like the first 20 minutes of the episode, something like that.
Jeff, did you do the quote about he thinks he's better than us because, and then I know you said that, but did you say the bit about because he listens to a certain kind of music?
Yeah, Amy Lou Harris.
Yeah, right.
And then the other thing is, Felton picks on like what he wears, and he uses that again because he talks about like This is a black homicide detective. He wears a tie with a pink polo player on it. And then later, when Pembleton tries to say that Felton's issue with him is that he's black, Felton goes, "The way you dress, who even knows you're black?"
Yeah, and there's that thing where there was a scene where he'll call a street Fremont because like he grew up there and that's how he knew it.
Yeah,
and,
right. And he changed it to
Frank
Martin Luther
takes it
King.
as a slur. Because
Yeah,
it's MLK.
You call it that because you're racist, and he's like, no, that's just where I knew that street is that, and then they changed the name of it. And I understand exactly how he feels about that because we had a street. There's a neighborhood near where I grew up where all the streets are named after cows. Yeah, and the main street through there was Jersey. Well, they renamed Jersey George Bush Drive because they were trying to get the George Bush Library here.
Ah,
and it worked. We do have it here now, but I mean that wasn't the only thing they did. But that was part of the whole presentation. Is they changed the name of this? It's a pretty main street to George Bush Drive. But there were people that protested that, and I wasn't for the change either. It had nothing to do with George Bush himself personally. It's just that's Jersey. You're not supposed to change the name.
Yeah, especially the ISTJ is like a little bit more systematic. It's like, look, the name after chaos. You're breaking the sequence.
Yeah, exactly.
So, like I said, it's like I would say here. I mean, if we're going to talk a little bit about functions, like I said, I see three kinds of extroverted feeling. Like there's that kind where you assert what the right and the wrong is, like, and maybe you could say. The way Frank relates to his religion, like he's I think the main thing is that he it would be interesting if you could do a type and faith video with Frank Pembleton. And I think that the reason is that I think the reason why he doesn't have the faith is that he's unhappy with the amount of evil that there is in the world. And that he doesn't really, I think he doesn't want to believe in a God that would allow that much evil.
Yeah, I think I'm going to make a very general statement here, and obviously, it's not that I have the testimony of millions of people or anything, but my sort of theory, sort of based on my own experience and other people that I have talked to, is that SFPs can struggle with faith because of that sort of combination of the ethics and the realism of it, because we are so like grounded in reality that when you present a case and say, this is something you need to believe in that is beyond what you can experience with your senses. It's not that I can't accept that exists because I want to believe in it, but it's always going to be pulled the other direction because anytime there's sort of a conflict between what we're told to believe on faith and what we see in reality, then our instinct is to lean on the reality part.
Yeah. Also, is that bit there, right there, what we're told to believe now. And, SFPs and artisans in general don't like being told.
Yeah, and that's the weird thing, specifically with Frank, with his being the Catholic Church, because it's a very polarizing church. Because they're very, obviously there's some that aren't maybe as strongly this way than others, but in general, the church is very hierarchical and very traditional and strict on a lot of things. It's like, these are the ways, contrast that with a church that is like, hey, everybody show up and do whatever and worship.
Is it Pentecostal where they go and have it's all enjoyable and they're having a dance and a sing?
Yeah, well, there's a lot more sort of like free spirit kind of attitude. So there's a big contrast in that. So the Catholic Church, at least out of all the Christian churches, would be the one that you would think in general artisans are going to have the toughest time because this is the most like by the book kind of structure, respect tradition and authority and all that. But the thing about that is that I've talked about before, artisans sort of need structure to have something to push against. So there's this relationship with a church like that for those that have grown up in it, where it's like my identity or my existence is sort of based on being the rebel within the structure. And that's very much how Frank comes off, is that he was, because of he had this training and education that he grew up with, and because he's intelligent and a free thinking person, he challenges all of that, and so he's constantly. It's like he's living his life. He's hearing these things that he's taught echo in himself. He feels whatever spiritual connection he feels to God or through humans or whatever. And then the evidence he sees all around him is people doing all of these evil things. And he has a tough time reconciling.
Yeah. And
those elements.
Also some of the things with, like with certain medieval monks and with the Jesuits, I sort of get the impression that it might be a bunch of INTPs sort of like doing where the cover is religion, but really they want access to the books. It's about, and they'll say things like, "Oh no, we're getting closer to God through knowledge," that sort of thing. And maybe with the scholastics, that like I certainly in the Middle Ages, it's like if you're an INTP, that's where they have the books. Oh, become a monk, like Enneagram 5, study the text, and they did have this thing, didn't they? Like the more truth you get towards, the closer you get to God, and these sort of things. And so there's that part of it, like I said, with some of the background. And so getting back on track, I'll get relevant. The Jesuits, are they a bit more the way that Frank maybe been brought up, where they are a little bit, go more into the nuances of what is meant maybe in the biblical text, with more of the nuances there rather than the straightforward following stuff. So maybe there's something in the Jesuit religion there. I don't know enough about the Jesuit religion and how they teach it. I mean, they might teach it as something to debate.
Well, I'm certainly no expert either, but I think there's more of a encouragement of
interpretation,
or at least I'm trying to think. Again, there's a phrase or a word I'm not thinking of, but it is something about using reason or I don't know, something about. They have a specific word for it now. I'm just totally going blank, but I don't think it's reason, but it's something along those lines of using that as opposed to a literal interpretation of the Bible.
Yeah, like, it sounds like they created it for rationals.
Like the more evangelical churches that are like, the Bible is the word of God, everything is as literally translated as possible, versus using sort of this is the basis, but a lot of it was, allegory, parable, whatever. Like, it's not supposed to be taken all literally,
That really sounds like, for me, because we know the temperaments have existed for thousands of years. That does sound, if not by rationals, but that would appeal to rationals.
Well, yeah, I mean, even Kersey said that the four Gospels were another example of, the representations of the four temperaments telling the story. And Mark is the artisan gospel because he's the most like, what was the actual action? What actually happened? What are the, we get to the point really quick and we tell you, here's what went down, whereas the more concrete gospel, Matthew, starts with this long list of the historical family tree of Jesus. Because it has to establish the history, and this is why this is important, because it's passed down through all of these generations. And then the other two, Luke and John, are the more abstract, so they represent more of the idealist and rational presentation of the same events. So they focus much more on the concepts and less on the actions. I don't know if Ben had to check out suddenly or what, but I'm going to say, just looking what's on the screen here about performing is putting on a show or demonstration of some kind to entertain others. It is, and for me, the thing I enjoy the most is entertaining others. But in the context of talking about Frank Pembleton, he doesn't always do it to entertain others. Sometimes he does it, as in that clip we talked about earlier, for a purpose, or possibly more than one purpose, because he's trying to get an end result that isn't just entertainment, whether it's used to get a confession or whatever it is, he's kind of, sometimes it is just sort of entertain others or himself. Like I said earlier about sort of times where he would just sort of kind of rant about something just because sort of enjoying going off on a rant on something. But when you get to the point where it says playful and fun-loving, probably most of the people that dealt with Frank, at least in a work situation, would probably not describe him as playful and fun-loving. So that's another case where it's like the perception of some people might not necessarily match that. And when I did my video preferences versus reality, I talked about how some of these things in the ESFP description are the actual descriptions of the preferences in terms of what we would prefer. But some of them are more circumstantial. They're more like, this is how they come across to others. And that's true to a point if the circumstances allow them to. But in my case, I feel like there's definitely some times where I wanted to be, the person who fits the playful, fun-loving, charming type person. But I didn't always come off that way to people, depending on the circumstances I was in.
And I very much like that. That's my favorite video of yours, Jeff, the ESFP preferences versus reality. And we could sort of do that as we go through this, where it's like, this is where Frank is like this, and this is how he's not like this.
Yeah.
Or this
and
way
what I was saying, I think when you checked out briefly there, was that sometimes his performing is not necessarily just to entertain others. It's for, and necessarily, with other ESFPs too, it can sometimes be for another purpose. Though I personally can say I enjoy it the most when it's entertaining to others, but that isn't necessarily always what it's used for. I think it's just so natural to us. Our instinct, people look at performing and they think of like people in the industry of entertainment or performing. And they're like, oh, that's this thing that people do. And then they get off stage and they live their normal life. But the reality is, for those of us that are performers as a type, that is our normal life. That's what our instinct is. It's not just, oh, this is a job to have, and then you get off and do what you enjoy doing. That's the part we do enjoy, and it's the other parts of life that are the harder part that feel like work.
And so when you do your ISTJ-like job, you do it in a way that shows your preference. You do it in a typical way, an ESFP way, as much as
I can do that. Yeah, I have to sort of keep myself sane. If I really just did everything by the book letter of my job, I would not have been able to do it as long as I have, because it's just driven me crazy a long time ago.
Did you say things like, just a slight digression, if someone rings up and it's the wrong number, like you might put voices on or do things like that?
I've done other characters on the phone and things like that, other accents and names and things like that. And just even just in very little things, like my coworkers when they come in and just to start trying to do the small talk thing. I have a ESTJ coworker. She'll ask me how I'm doing, and I sort of rotate a series of things I say in response. But she says, I never know quite what you're going to say, and that's like what I'm shooting for. I don't want people to know exactly what I'm going to say.
So it's like one of the things here, like where something's like that final sentence, like such performers radiate warmth and festivity, lift other spirits. Like in the role of the detective, though, you're not really going to be able to do that. Like you're turning up, you're in a serious mode. Your son's just being killed.
Yeah, so, I don't think most of the time. Yeah, there are cases. I think that's an area where there are times where those aspects about kindness and compassion can sometimes come into play, but probably not as much warmth and festivity in that situation.
Yeah, and also in those situations, like he's putting the job first and he wants the facts, and it's like, and he knows that he wants a description as soon as possible because of the memories are going to fade of people, or it gives them time to like think their alibi up or get the story straight. And I think they want it soon. Yeah,
but right from the beginning, like in the first episode, you establish, like, if somebody is watching Homicide and taking everything literally, they would see Frank as somebody who is this intense, serious guy or whatever. But if you really look at it, like in the scenes where he's playfully mocking Bayless in already, even without really knowing him. Just he's sort of seeing him. He comes in as he's just the rookie. So he starts telling him like the rules, because he knows this is like what he can already tell that Bayless is coming in. Like he's got this book about how to solve crimes. And he's like, this kid thinks he's just going to walk in here and like read a book and solve homicides. And so Pembleton already starts messing with him because he says like, what do you observe about the suspect? And Bayless starts like listing facts about him physically, you know, like how tall he is and what he's wearing and all these things. And Frank goes, no, the suspect is asleep. And he's like, and then I can't remember if he gives it a number, like rule number 9 or something like that. And then he says like a guilty man left alone in the box falls asleep. And so Bayless is kind of like, are there other rules? And he's like, yeah. And he just starts kind of throwing these things out, like, you know, too excited, not excited enough to, you know, he's like, you know, but he's basically messing with him.
Yeah, I can see all artisans doing that, and even myself, once in a while, like let's see if they're gonna swallow this.
Yeah, but even in that, like he's still like, you can see just watching him, like he's performing even in that. He kind of gets on a roll with this. You know, the rookie is hanging on my every word, so I'm just gonna
because he wants to make it believable. It's like he wants to like tell them along, like. And plausible rules to follow.
There's just this enjoyment of just sort of having someone hang on your words like that and just throwing these things at them like, here's this stuff I know, you know? And it's like his own insecurities are not present in that moment. They're still there, but he's not thinking about any of that. He's just like, in this moment, I'm the one in control and I can just throw this stuff out, and this guy is just listening to it all. Because he's looking at me for inspiration or for guidance.
Although sometimes, though, you could argue that if you want to go to functions, that might be like certain patterns that he's picked up. You know, say about what is it that the guilty man doesn't fall asleep, or
no, he does.
Oh, well, the opposite then, probably the opposite.
Yeah, he says if it's somebody who's innocent, then they're actually more worried about, you know, getting arrested for the crime, so they're constantly like when they're left alone in the box, then they can't fall asleep because they're like too jacked up about what's happening. And if they're guilty, they fall asleep because they're like there's not anything that actually keeps them worried about anything. It's like they've already been caught.
Yeah, but you know, we can sort of see the reasoning that he's going with, because they might get off, but yes, they're being questioned, but anyhow.
It's like the scene from the very first episode that Kellerman was in, the fire. I guess actually technically it was the second episode. It was a 2-parter, but where he does the sort of like try to make friends with the suspect thing, and contrast him with Pembleton as being like this intense guy who's up in your face about stuff, and he's like, yeah, I'm more like, I'm just trying to figure this out. Talking me about whatever, and then he casually just sort of like buddies with him, and then when he's about to leave, then he just casually throws out, "Why'd you kill the dog?" And the guy goes, "I didn't know the dog was there," because he's not thinking. He's just like, he gets along with the guy, so then he's just like, oh, he's comfortable enough with me. I can just ask him this question that nails him on the fact he's the killer. He's the one that set the fire. Because we're just having this casual conversation. It's not an interrogation where he's all geared up to stay on his story.
I think when we were reviewing that episode, I think there was a thing that happened with that Frank had a little bit of competition because like Kellerman was sort of like
the
case before him,
right?
And then at one point, it's always good.
There'd always been this thing up to that point where, like I was saying earlier, Frank was seen as like he's the one that gets in there and solves the cases. At his detective skills, he just gets on a roll and doing these things. And in that episode, it was like Kellerman was one step ahead of him. Everything he was trying to do, it was like Kellerman had been there first, and he wasn't used to that. So yeah, they get very competitive about it.
Right. Is there anything else from that first First paragraph.
I think there are times where Pembleton does try to charm suspects for that kind of the same reason I was talking about with Kellerman, where he's kind of trying to throw them off their game by sort of connecting with them on a personal level, being like, okay, you know, I'm on your side. He does that a little bit in the first episode with the guy who strangled the old guy in the hotel, because he sort of like gives him that opportunity to make it less of a crime. You know, he sort of throws out the scenario of here's what happened, and you know, but he also is like talking him out of getting a lawyer into signing the paper to waive his right to a lawyer.
Yeah, I remember early on that Bayliss was sort of like, he sort of confronted Frank on that about his procedure being a little bit against the book.
Right.
In terms of like, it was pushing the legalities of with the suspect. In I think was it actually around that particular issue? Was it actually that issue where Bayliss picked him up on that?
Yeah, that's where when Pembleton blows up at him later in the episode, because he says that's where he has his line about, is that a line from your textbook, rookie? Stay out of my face.
Yeah. And then we've got stuff like it's certainly utilitarian, and that would be an example of a utilitarian approach. Pretty concrete in his communication, even though he's got like a wide vocabulary.
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking earlier. Is like he will bring up concepts and sort of more philosophical topics, but he still always brings it back to the concrete examples. It never gets too deep in the weeds. You know,
and even if it is abstract, it's not abstract in like the kind of things Munch would say as an ENTP. I
was about to say,
like
the biggest contrast you see is with Munch, because he's like the truly intuitive type in the squad. So he always comes off as the one that's most kind of out there in what he's talking about. Even when he's talking about, he in his case, it's the opposite. He takes the concrete things that are really happening and he goes back to the concepts to talk.
Yeah, and it's like, oh, this is an example of this, and then he goes to the abstraction.
Yeah, which is why he and Bolander made such a great team, because Bolander always brings it back to the reality, and sort of they sort of check each other on those things.
Although there are sometimes, like every now and then, where Bolander, there was one episode where Bolander was sort of getting philosophical about stuff. But just sort of like maybe just whining in terms of life being bad. And there were moments when he had his philosophical moments. Bolander, I think. Oh yeah, there's that thing. Yes, the optimistic yet cynical. And I remember this. So it's like the cynical, because I during the summer I read all of the Kersey chapters about the temperaments. So I read the whole of the Artisan chapter and memorized these bits. So what the cynical relates, because I used to think that sounds a bit like a contradiction, optimistic and cynical, but it's cynical in the sense of cynical about people's motives, but mainly it's about that there's not this grand pattern of cause and effect, whereas the idealist will think that, oh, this happened for a reason. Whereas the attitude of the artisan is that, oh, that's just bad luck, or that's just good luck. And so the
way that I always explain that is like cynical about is more of a general.
Yeah.
Like, so when people try to say, oh, there's this grand cause you need to join because we've got to save the world, and you know, whereas we'll look at it and be like, people have been saying that for thousands of years, nothing ever changes. The optimistic is, but humanity has survived all these years, so we'll keep surviving. One way or another, things will work out. And for us personally, we'll find some way to get along. That's where the optimism is. So you can very easily be both simultaneously, because it's like the cynicism is like, I'm not going to swallow whatever stuff you're feeding me about how I've got to be on your side and do all these amazing things to save everybody. But at the same time, I believe something will work out because it always has before.
But Jeff, before this event, you told me that you were in a thing, and I think it was optimistic that you were in, that were part of that thing beforehand. because you were doing like meeting a group of people, and you could argue that the members of those kind of people are very optimistic in thinking that the United States will go in that direction.
It's funny you should say that, though, because one of the conversations I had today, because we had a candidate there who's running for governor for next year. And I was getting I was doing that that probing or questioning thing, because I was asking him, what is he going to do differently to get himself enough attention that he has any chance of actually winning? And one of the other guys in the group is actually was the candidate for sheriff last year. He says, well, if he can get 3%, that'd be great, because then they can get like ballot access, for the next time. And I'm like, well, that's great, but 3%, like, why? I'm like, that still sounds pathetic to me. It's like, so I was more optimistic in the sense that I'm like looking at it as, what is the practical way to actually win, but cynical enough and realistic enough to say, well, it's a long shot. It would be considered a miracle if you were able to do this, but that's still the goal. You're not going into it thinking, well, I'm going to try to get 3%,
Jeff, do you want to say what organization this was part of?
Not really, because I don't want to get too off track of what we're talking about.
Okay. We'll put that under our hats, folks.
But as far as
based on the percentages, right?
Yeah. But the point is, like, okay, say you're taking this back to homicide. Like, if you gave that kind of percentage to Frank in his job, said, well, if you're going to be able to solve 3% of the homicide cases that you get, he would be like, well, what's the point then? Why am I bothered?
He would put it reversed, like 90.
Yeah.
What percentage would he like? What percentage do you think he'd give the job up at?
Yeah, and even that aspect, like, because with Howard, they had the thing where she had the streak of where she had solved all the cases, like 100%.
Yeah, like every single case.
And in the book, the show kind of took they sort of softened that a little bit, because in the book it was a real source of anxiety, because and some animosity between the other detective, because there was this feeling was, if she didn't have a sure thing, she didn't take the case. So it was almost like it became this thing where, oh, well, we can't give that case to her because it's going to mess up her streak. And then that's more important than actually solving the murder, And they did explore that on the show by having the episode where the streak finally ends, and, she's frustrated because she has the case that was Cressetti's, that wasn't her case to begin with, which that I think the show made up. I don't believe that was in the book, but they don't explore what eventually happened with that, because, like I said, the book, it was just 1 year. So it was everything that took place in that year, and there's a lot of loose ends at the end where they don't go back and say, well, all of this got solved, because it didn't, at least not in a year.
And so there's like rather less obvious things, like for him, like, well, arts and craft. Well, for the performer, their body, their face, their acting, that's their tool that they work with.
Yeah, and there were some aspects where, you talked earlier about some of the, like, circles he ran in or whatever. He had certain interest in do with music and, like, wine and things. Like, there were some things that he were sort of his, I guess, arts and crafts, if you want to call it that, in terms of the hobbies or whatever that he sort of had outside the job. But yeah, definitely the preoccupied with technique part fits for him for sure, because so much of his
interrogation technique.
Yeah, so much of his focus was on technique in every aspect, not just in the box, so that was like his element, but even in the other aspects of canvassing, as they say, when he would be around crime scenes or interviewing people or dealing with his partners or whatever it is he was doing. The little things he'd throw out, like when he worked with Lewis, when they had that case where the bullet had been shot up in the air and had killed somebody, and it turned out to be a kid.
Yeah.
First.
There was a racial element to that.
Yeah, immediately Pembleton first was suspecting the people on the wrong side of the tracks, as they say, whereas Lewis was like, hey, wait a minute, why do you not believe it came from that direction where the rich people live, So, yeah, it was not just a race, but a class aspect to it, where And Pembleton basically defended that by saying, like, I'm not saying that I know that for sure this is happening, but it's like if you look at it, if you detach emotionally and just look at the statistics of it, it's more likely it came from this.
Yeah, it's a little bit more like in function talk, maybe a bit stronger extroverted thinking in Frank, and Lewis is going more by the principle and his feelings.
Yeah, he got a little more defensive about it, and as it turned out, he ended up being right. But of course, it wasn't really exactly how either one of them thought.
And just that thing about hedonistic, it's like, it's not that he's going out like racing cars and doing like sports and stuff. It's like what is fun for him, even if it's just like the challenge of the job. And he just said like nailing somebody in the interrogation room.
Yeah, he gets a rush
most
out of
enjoyment. But even the stuff with the competition, and are you going to get the saves? I mean, because there is a thing with artisans that it's like the actual challenge is fun in itself.
Right. And the scenes you talked about earlier where he was in the box with the girl, the multiple personalities girl, and he had to do this thing where he was like, you know, like you said, like seducing her almost, like he got like this rush out of that too, because it's here this situation where outside of this circumstance, obviously there were people that thought he went too far with that anyway, but outside of that, everybody would have thought that. But in the circumstance, it's like some people would justify it because he was trying to solve a murder case. So it's like within this context, I can get away with these aspects. And so I can have this sort of perverse enjoyment of this thing. And it's not going to at least likely result in any bad consequences because of the circumstances of it. But
yeah, so we can say impact in the interrogation room, the box, and that's where he's a virtuoso. Or
and there, yeah,
is the best.
I was going to say there's another scene with Kellerman where he does the same thing with somebody he's trying to get information from, where he basically allows her to seduce him, but he stops it once he gets what he needs. Then he basically just leaves her hanging. And is like, okay, you know, she had gone so far as to actually take her clothes off, and he just looks at her and then leaves.
I think he should have just like, you know, they should have like made that. You know, when the woman was like, and she takes it, I think I would have cut the scene there, like, to the viewer's imagination, is to see what he would have done there. Because, you know, ESTP.
It works either way, because it's kind of like, yeah, I could see it going that, but I like the fact they sort of played it against type, whereas you think he's going to go for it, and then he's like, well, I have what I need, bye.
Yeah, and plus he was early on his, you know, he didn't want to like he didn't want to that phrase revert to type, because he was like early in the season. Maybe if he was like a detective for about 5 years, and he might have thought, yeah, actually I'll take advantage of it. Just like Frank taking advantage of like the basketball game when he should have been off doing something. So that again, tactics, just the use of tactics in the box, tactics in the interrogation room. Again, the pleasing of others, again, not really in the role that we see him in, because the role doesn't really. That's one of the best things about Kersey to me is, besides the theory of, and it's linked up, the theory of the intellect is the idea of looking at somebody in the context of, well, what role are you seeing this person in? How much of what you're seeing is because of the role that they're in, and not just their type.
The next part about, you know, playing to the audience and stuff. I'm like, Morgan would say he's being a drama queen.
That's
because of moments like when they have the episode where they were forced into the other office because of the gas leak, and which actually happened, by the way. The real building that Homicide shot in had the gas leak, so they had to move the production. So they just put it in the script.
When it was in the room, I was like, there was a random thing where there was this thing on the wall, and it was like,
exactly.
What is this thing?
It's funny because you talk about the adaptability, and he is adaptable. He does adapt to it, but he still like makes a performance out of complaining about it, and like goes so far as to he slams the door on the refrigerator a bunch of times, and then he has the thing because it's supposed to be like a bank building. I think it's supposed to be a bank vault, and this thing that comes down. He's like, "In this, what is this?"
Yeah, and it was like, because it's like, it's not. you can say it's like one of his tools. It's like, this is not the right stage
Yeah.
for me. You know,
Yeah, so it's
maybe it's not big
very
enough.
much just like, you know, a prima donna actor reacting to,
Oh,
you know, something in the
and because he respects G so much, he wants G watching him get the confession.
yeah, but he's very obviously putting on a show for people when he
Yep.
does things like slamming the refrigerator door and all this stuff. He wants to sort of make this big production out of it, when in reality, he's really not that much bothered by it. They sort of play it, and Bayless interprets it, because it was the same episode after he found out that his wife was pregnant. And so Bayless sort of looks at it as, oh, this is him uncomfortable about being a father, so he's taking it out on everybody. But the reality is we don't really need an excuse like that.
Yeah, it might just be in the moment you want to express it, and like in that moment it's serious or half serious.
It could be retroactively used as a justification for something, but the reality is we just sort of enjoy doing that sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to tell you how ESFP is doing. I mean, like, you're in a better position than me, Jeff, to say what it's like on the inside.
I described that to somebody, I can't remember who it was, that just had a hard time believing what I was saying, when I'm like, sometimes it just feels good to have like a fit about something.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see that.
And it's different. It's not actually like it. You know, I think it was probably in that one of those conversations we had about, you know, not feeling guilt or whatever, because.
Right. Okay. I'm gonna get that. I'll get that.
Because I don't want to actually hurt anyone those times that I do that. It's not about actually delivering any kind of lasting damage. It is about making an impact, but not about like any kind of emotional impact. It's just like, in the moment, this feels good to do, to sort of to get the attention focused on me, and just sort of do this thing that people will be like, wow, what was that? You know, that kind of reaction, as opposed to something that's actually lingering. And I even said, even talked about that with my younger brother, who's ISTP. You know, we had our video where he talked about when he would play like video games like World of Warcraft and stuff, that he enjoyed like sort of doing things that made random people in the game react like, who was that masked stranger? You know, that's the example of that making an impact, where it's sort of people have this impression of you that you've left.
Right. Yeah, I was going to try and find that thing about you talking about guilt, and it's when you're talking about like the way that you heard other kids talking about it was like a thing that really got them in the guts, whereas for you it wasn't something that lingered that much. You didn't sort of feel it.
Yeah, they specifically had a whole episode of Seventh Heaven about that, where they talked about the feeling of guilt gut, and I was like, yeah, I don't have that.
But you also are very attentive not to hurting people's feelings.
Yeah, there's a different. That's the thing, is I have people say, well, if you don't feel guilt, you're some kind of like sociopath or whatever. I don't think that's true, because I think to be sociopathic, you've got to basically have a complete disconnect from what your actions, how they impact other people and their feelings and stuff. And I don't believe I have that. I think I'm very aware. It's just I don't have that specific kind of after the fact, like something eats me up that way. It doesn't. The most anxiety I felt in my life has been when one of two things: either there was some sort of obligation hanging over me in the future that I was worried about, or I thought I was going to get caught for doing something I was quote unquote not supposed to do.
Right.
Those are the two main things that cause me anxiety, not anything that I did in the past. You know, that's why I've never. That's why I describe it as not feeling guilt, how most people describe it, because it's just not something.
This is one of the areas where Kersey temperament is so good, in that especially SFPs experience feelings is quite different from, say, the NFs in the way they experience it. In that there seems to be part of the artisan temperament where it's like you tend to get over stuff a little bit easier than, say, NFs when it comes, because it's more like that was a thing that was in a moment and now's another moment. It seems to be an ability to move on.
Yeah, I think
better.
That's true, but also sometimes our feelings can be hurt even easier because it's always very much right below the surface.
Yeah. Is also sometimes with you that, in terms of performance, is it sometimes it can be, okay, I'm hurt by that, but I don't want to show I'm hurt by that.
Oh, definitely.
Can I get that performance?
Yeah, both ends of that.
Yeah.
Times where it is where I am hurt by something and don't want to show it, and other times where I play it up where, I'm not really as hurt as I sort of act like I am, just because it sort of feels good to act that way.
Yeah. I remember somebody saying that one of the things about I think you said that someone at work said to you, Jeff, I never know what you're going to say next, and you thought that was like a brilliant compliment.
Yeah, I said that earlier in this exact video, Ben.
Oh, sorry, I was probably doing something behind the scenes. That's arranging for. So you can see here, Ruth. This is how I find out so much about temperament, is through listening to Jeff since 2013. What was this about? Yeah, playing to an audience. The excitement of playing to an audience. Try to generate a sense of showtime wherever they are. To a certain extent, you see that when he's in the car with Bayliss. Just if he's getting bored.
Yeah, that goes back to what we said about like, he's kind of holding court about a particular subject, but it's not.
Yeah.
Convincing Bayliss of something is not really the important part. It's just sort of
just get it out
having to say, like when he goes into the whole thing about Bayliss has to find his dark side and all that. Because they even specifically address that later, because Bayliss referred to it and said, you told me I had to find this thing. And I forgot exactly what Frank said, but I think he said something like that was just car talk or something like that. Like he just missed it. So it was so funny because it was like he made such a big deal, and it reminded me of a story Norm Macdonald told. I'll try to tell it real quick so it won't take, we're already gone 2 hours. But Norm Macdonald talked about meeting his like comedy hero, which was Rodney Dangerfield, and he said that he met him. I don't remember if Rodney Dangerfield was hosting Saturday Night Live or he was just there for whatever reason and guesting or something. But anyway, I think he was there during the time Norm Macdonald was on SNL, and basically that Rodney told him like, that stand-up was like the most important or most enjoyable thing in comedy, and he was like all these other things like, is like TV, movies, these things. That's all just shit. It's like stand up is where it's at. So Norm's like says he saw him again like a while later because he had really like sort of taken that to heart and tried to like work on his stand-up act and really focus on that for a while. So he meets Rodney again somewhere and like goes into this whole thing about how he really took it to heart and worked on his stand-up. And he said Rodney looks him in the eye and goes, "Let me tell you something, kid. Stand-up is shit." It's like basically like just sort of dismissed this thing that was some profound statement to him. It was just like, whatever. Like, get out of my face, kid. I don't care about this.
Yeah, he also he would do things for effect. Like he didn't have this whole thing about talking about he was the most underrated comedian in the United States. Like nobody gives him any respect, and he sort of like used that as a technique,
right?
To then get attention.
Yeah, he figured out like there was something about So one time, like he was talking about this, and like his tie came loose right at that moment, so he straightened his tie, and that became part of the trademark because it got such a strong reaction. Him straightening his tie while he talked about not having a respect. So then it became such a part of his physical mannerisms after that it was like the whole thing with the tie was like a physical thing, like a timing mechanism.
And if people want to see more of Rodney Dangerfield, just type in like Rodney Dangerfield. Not so much Leno, but the guy before him. The guy
before him. Johnny Carson?
Yes, that guy. Yes, he did it for decades. Yeah.
That guy.
That guy.
But yeah, getting back to Frank, I think that's the example from that I was saying is that I think, Bayliss took this, profound thing about, you told me about getting in touch with my dark side, and Frank was just like, that was car talk, that was wasn't something, it obviously had not been something that was as important to Frank as it was to Bayless.
Yeah, he does do some wisecracks, Frank.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
I'll ask Ruth. So, like, theoretically, Ruth, ESFP is meant to be your sort of, like, ideal type. Are you thinking when you're going through this, oh, I've got to get me one of these. I've got to get me one of these ESFPs.
No, I've heard that theory before, and the way I think of it is, like S.E.E, I want that more for myself. Like that's something that I would want to work on for myself, but it's not something I really feel very attracted to. I actually kind of find it like too competitive.
So you're attracted to the idea of ESFPs, but not the actual people?
I guess.
Yeah, because it's a function thing that, like, say, an INTJ has an inner ESFP. And even Dario Nardi has sort of used that phrase because in terms of functions, the functions are in reverse. So INTJ would be like NITE, FI, SE, and then it's upside down for ESFP, SE, FI, TE, NI. And I think there's something to it when the people are like different halves of the same coin. So it's like if you have like an INTJ that's got a little bit of an ESFP side to them, it's like there's something there about the person where you can think they can sort of be encouraged to come out of themselves. Or if you've got, say, an ESFP that's looking to sort of develop themselves, then I can sort of like, then you can sort of say, okay, these two people are ready for each other. But if you've got someone who's like an extreme ESFP and an extreme INTJ, they've got like hardly anything in common, and then it doesn't. I don't think it works at all. This idea of complementary opposites.
Yeah, well, I have some experience with this because my father and one of my best friends growing up were both INTJs, so I kind of saw some of that dynamic. I think that my experience is that I feel like they were sort of fascinated by me in a way, like, and sort of had moments of maybe envying me, or at least how I was able to enjoy certain things that they struggled with because they kind of maybe couldn't completely let themselves go. Sometimes they were too focused on sort of analyzing things or worrying about stuff that was whatever it is they were considering. But I also had, my friend who said actually signed my yearbook one year. He said something like, "You're actually very smart. Just apply yourself," or something like that, which is funny to get from a friend rather than like a teacher or something. But that kind of reminds me of something Ben said when describing me as a witty ESFP, like trying to make that like it was a contrast or something. Like, no, I think he even put, but you were like ESFP, but witty or something like that.
Something like that. Yeah, I don't know what I was thinking at the time. It was something like ESFP, but witty.
Anyway, and my father actually described me once as, quote, my most level-headed rugrat, which I was actually a little bit surprised by at the time because I never would have described myself as level-headed. But after sort of reviewing some of this personality stuff, it made a little more sense to me because I thought, well, despite the fact that both of my brothers are thinker types and thus in some ways had more in common with my father, sort of the method of thinking was maybe more similar to me, in theory anyway. So
yeah, another the context of the show is that a lot of the episodes are quite dark, and you're sort of seeing people like you do see them like there's an element of, you know what I mean? It's like they can't be completely because like a lot of the cases are quite tough, and you sort of like play on Frank's ethics in terms of like there was that bit early on where it's like we speak for the dead, like in order to get justice for the dead, So there is like this ethical thing there with Frank that might, you know, he's not laughing and joking all the while, but like there are moments there of wisecracks rather than levity. Definitely with the wisecracks.
Oh yeah, and I think you have certain interactions between certain characters, and when Frank and Munch talk, you see a lot of that because Munch very much goes for the sort of dark humor way of looking at things too. So when the two of them are interacting, then they sort of play off each other on those things.
Yeah, I remember one time Frank pushed Munch because it's like Munch can go a little bit too far with yeah.
Yeah, those two, going again, it's sort of like when they're on the same side, then they can be a pretty good team, but when they're opposed to each other, then they clash pretty hard. So
yeah, what have we got? So the eat, drink, and be merry thing doesn't, but like I said, we don't really see. But you could say it's like low key, be merry.
Yeah, not a lot. I mean, you saw a little bit of him with his wife, and a little bit with other people, but for the most part, yeah, not as much. But again, that's perception. Like I said, there's people that have known me that probably would say, well, that doesn't sound like Jeff. And then other people that would say that's exactly like me. So it kind of depends on the context that they knew me.
Also, it's like with the class thing. I sort of think like the people who are in the sort of like the higher classes tend to sort of like the way they're merry is a little bit more controlled. Like it seems a little bit more subdued because it's usually sort of more formalized. It's like, so for example, if Frank's out at a fancy restaurant and it's like his merriment probably be a little bit more controlled than say if he was the kind of guy who was like down the pub, like Lewis. So Lewis as an introvert might seem merrier than Frank, who's in a sort of like in a fine restaurant where everyone's in a suit and tie and sort of like more.
Yeah, it's like I said, I think before we actually started recording, it was like Lewis was more easygoing because you asked me about, because I'd said something like actually liking Lewis better despite Pembleton being the one I related to more. Because you don't necessarily always like the character that's the most like you, or like them the best, because you see their flaws also. And like, I mean, not that I didn't see any flaws in Lewis, but he's just overall like, he seems like a kind of guy that would be more fun to hang out with. In general.
Also, just the body language differences between. In fact, if someone was just typing, like, say if they just heard like the body language, they might think, just based on the way Lewis moves, they might think he is the extrovert, he is the ESFP.
Right, and part of that is
it's environment.
Sort of the persona that he's adopting himself, because the adaptation that he's made is, this is what sort of allows me to carve out a niche. I'm sort of like the smooth guy. That's my thing. But you see on more than one occasion when he does that, when he's kind of flirting with women that he finds attractive, he sort of has that handed back to him sometimes. So he's not necessarily always as smooth as he sort of tries to portray himself.
Yeah, he's also like, he's very big on, like I said, he has that connection to the community. And it's like, if anyone challenges him on that, he'll come back and it's like, hey, I'm from this community, and it's like that is a big part.
Yeah, and he was able to use that successfully in the final season when they had the episode where Shepard, when they were partnering together and she had her gun stolen, and he went to the place and basically like announced to everybody that it needed to be returned. There's probably not any of the other cops in the squad that would have been able to pull that off the way he did. But because,
so
like you said,
what needs to be returned?
The gun.
Ah, right.
But he, like you said, he has that tie to the community where he had the credibility where he could do that and it would actually get the right result.
Yeah, there was one where they went a little bit over the top where like he went into a hall and he says, right, and I don't know if it's that thing you're talking about, but I'm not mean earlier on where it's like, and he actually demands that somebody say something, and it seemed like, or somebody hands something over. I can't remember what it was. and he sort of made a grand entrance. Do you remember that? There was like a scene where he made a grand entrance and he got all these people and he's like, I want this information, or I want to know, out of a crowd.
Well, there was another scene where it was sort of a crowd scene on the street. And he thought, well, if I appeal to him, somebody will step up and say something, and nobody did.
And then there was that thing with, he had that personal grudge with Mahoney, and it was like you're on my corner, and like I'm not going to let you be the bully on my corner. This is my corner. When like Mahoney tried to come into the bar.
You're right.
But here we go. Enjoying life is healthy for the most part, though it also makes them more subject to temptations than the other types. To the extent only with Frank is like with the nicotine. Like there's a theme of him trying to give up on cigarettes.
Yeah, if I recall correctly, the strongest things that drove him and his wife apart were really not like temptations in terms of, it wasn't another woman or anything like that. It was honestly more his own sort of personal demons, as well as him spending too much time on the job.
Yeah.
And so when he didn't show up for his daughter's christening ceremony, then it was sort of like she looked at it as that was him putting the job ahead of his family.
Did you mention earlier on when I was distracted about there was Frank not attending a funeral service because he didn't want to go in the church, but he did his own salute to the guy?
No, I didn't. And that's another great scene, because it's sort of like it again just sums up Frank, and that he's got the sort of moral objection that he is maybe playing up, but it's sort of a deeply personal thing, and he's using that as the justification. But then he also dresses up and sort of makes the show of it, so he brings the attention to himself at the same time. But he also really is sincere in showing the respect to Cressetti. So it's not just about him, and I think that's why it looks like the others take it in the right spirit. Nobody gets angry at him for doing that, because they kind of look at it as, well, that's just Frank, Frank being Frank, but he really did respect him. It wasn't him disrespecting him. It was just his way of doing it.
Impulsive, like moderately impulsive, like given the job, like not excessively slow, not any way that's going to compromise his job or the way he performs. Self-indulgent maybe when he's in the box, because he literally wants to indulge his ability to get the confession.
Sometimes I think he gets caught up in his sort of in what he's described, that rush that he feels in the box. So sometimes he just kind of goes in a direction, whether or not it's really what he needs to be doing.
Oh, did that ever come up where he might have done something in a box, and then somebody else said, and somebody actually criticized his technique because he actually failed to get the confession, and they might have said, well, that's because you were too busy showing off or something. Did that ever happen? Yeah,
there were a few exchanges like that between him and Bayless, especially because what they established over time is that they started out with it sort of being like, well, Frank had to guide Bayless on how to do things in the box because Bayless wasn't as good at that. But then he sort of developed his own style over time. And then they had the times where they were clashing, where they weren't on the same page with how they were going to do it. And then by then, Bayless had the confidence to believe that he wasn't just going to back down to Frank because he was more experienced. He was going to say, at this point, I know what I'm doing, So that was when they split up as partners again for a period of time for multiple reasons, but that was part of it. Frank thought that Bayless was let himself get too personally involved in cases, especially ones that involved children.
Yeah, that's the protector. And that's sort of like how you sort of came to that and other things that I can see ISFJ, the accommodator guardian.
Yeah,
Or,
the strongest, the clincher for me there was him actually going to help take care of the family member that had abused him. So it's like that to me is it's a common thing with that protector personality. It's like they feel themselves even obligated to protect those that didn't protect them.
yeah. Yeah, because like he's an old man, and he ends up like to a certain extent taking care of him and like getting food for him. And I think you're the one, Jess, said only an ISFJ would do that.
Yeah, that's obviously I can't like 100% prove that, but I'm like it really does seem like it pretty much that. You know, I knew one that I worked with where her mother, you know, was a drug addict and basically treated her like crap her whole time she was growing up. And even as an adult, even though she had, I guess, kicked the drug addiction, but she was still often would disappear for long periods of time and then come back wanting money, and she would still give her money or help her out, you know, sort of like somebody. Whereas I feel like if I had grown up with, I mean, I've talked about some of the things my father did, but he didn't even, I don't think he even treated me to that extent, you know, and I still don't really talk to him. And so the idea that of a parent of mine or somebody that treated me that way growing up coming back and wanting me to give them things like that would I would not have as much problem shutting somebody like that out of my life.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, because also ISFJ is thinking about, oh, it's their duty and stuff like that, stuff out of that sense of duty.
It's funny to think about Frank having a always look on the bright side motto, because obviously there were plenty of times where he doesn't come off that way.
Yeah, because it's the cynical thing of like, and he's got this cynical attitude of like crime makes you dumb and like, and he's cynical
but to be fair, I don't think any of the characters on that show really had that attitude. So it's kind of like one of those things where the job doesn't really lend itself to that.
Yeah, that's the thing. Because I remember. Okay, so yeah, yeah, I think we'll go on a bit more, Ruth, because we've got a few more. But I don't know if have you got any questions, Ruth?
Nope, nothing's come up.
Okay, because we'll go through the rest of these paragraphs. There's how many paragraphs in total? There's 10 paragraphs, and we're on paragraph 4. Yeah, we're gonna get this done. I don't think it's that vulnerable to seduction, but like, again, it's no, not really. Like, he's happily married. He's also married to the job.
Yeah, like I said about that, I think the seduction for him is less to do with specifically another person as it is with other things.
Yeah. Yeah. And even then, he gives up the job at the end of season
eventually.
6. Oh, yeah, so maybe we could talk about that. What did you think led to him giving up the job?
Well, you know, the reason he gave was basically like he tried to make it into an ethical thing. But honestly, I feel like he was just burned out. And I think he sort of in the movie, even though I don't like the ultimate, you know, one of the ultimate revelations in the movie, I did like the aspect of that he sort of admitted that it was more that he just burned out. He got tired of taking the confessions. So that's the flip side to that, where that rush he gets from being in the box, but he also has, it's the same thing as a sugar rush. You know, you have your initial rush, but then you have the crash. And that's exactly what would happen is like when he doesn't maintain that, then he feels sort of a burden from it. It's like all these people that have told me these terrible things they've done. Once I get over that rush from catching them on it, then those other aspects we were talking about earlier start to sink in. You know,
yeah, it's
all the aspects of the evil in the world and people, you know, being so violent and terrible to each other and all that, you know. And he says in the movie to Bayless, I couldn't listen to one more confession.
Yeah.
And again, that's one of those things where you're not sure how much of that is that really the reason, or was he just sort of coming up with another sort of dramatic thing to say? You know, what? Because honestly, I feel like overall it was probably just he was just tired of it. He wanted to do something else.
Yeah.
And they show him in the movie actually teaching, which definitely is one of those things where I thought, under the right circumstances, I could be a teacher. The things that would keep me from being a teacher are the aspects of what hoops they want you to jump through in order to be qualified.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And like I said, if they had like school vouchers and more independent schools,
but if it was
like
just
music.
Yeah, if it was a specialized thing where it's like you don't have to have this specific, or the opposite sort of general degree and all these things, you can just know, like a trade school type of thing.
Yeah,
like you have somebody that teaches, like, say, mechanic certification for cars or something. They don't necessarily have to have a degree. They just have to be certified themselves. Like, they know how to do it so they can teach other people. And it's kind of the same thing with, with other aspects of teaching. Is if it's more specialized to, somebody who has a great amount of knowledge in a particular subject can teach other people. And it's not about credentials.
Do you think you'd be a good drama teacher?
I could, but I don't know about that, because I'm not... Like, I think it depends, again, what kind of drama we're talking about. Like, I could probably be an improv teacher. But if you were like a general drama, because then a lot of times they'll want to talk about, like, history of it or different particular methods and all these kind of things that, I'm not necessarily well versed in or that interested in.
Right.
But government and politics is something I feel like I could teach, because I know I've studied enough that I could teach that in a way where I could kind of balance, like, the historical elements along with how things operate now, and I could do it in a way that engaged the class and made it interesting.
Right. Yeah, so I know Ruth has to get going. I don't know if you wanted, like, a graceful exit point.
Well, thanks for joining us and listening to us mostly ramble about a show you've never seen.
Glad you joined us, Ruth. And then we've got, and then this bit about this. This bit is, I think, is key to understand that, like, even though they can feel very strongly about things, but they will do what they feel like in the moment. Well, not so much what those. Not chalking up to experience of blaming someone else. Not so much that, but that idea of just have these very strong feelings in the moment. And an idealist, in seeing that, might think, oh, that's the core of the person. That's like the core conviction of the person. And it's like, but did you just forget that thing you just said there? That you, like, poured your soul out? And
yeah.
But part of that was for effect.
Right, and that's fun. It's funny to me on the flip side, because the NFPs especially will turn around and forget the facts of things that happened like a week ago, but then they'll remember very intensely, like, the feelings of whatever. And like you were saying, it's sort of the opposite with SFPs, because it's like that feeling wasn't necessarily as important to us as it would be to the NF, but we can remember the facts of the situation.
Yeah, and sometimes I think with ENFP is like there's a tension within them between their ethical side, like all the things they espouse, all their talk, because frequently an ENFP is also a 7, and it's like there's that part of them that wants to have fun, and so it's like, hang on a minute, you're doing that thing that you said was materialist. It's like, or sometimes they might have a big critique about these. Oh, there you are enjoying your iPhone. And so sometimes they can be a little bit inconsistent there, because there's that part of them that just wants to have fun. As you said, ENFPs are just like ESFPs, except ENFPs believe in stuff. So there is that part of them where it's like, oh, I thought you had convictions and stuff. No, you're just sort of enjoying yourself. Now you're like me. What happened? Whereas INFP is more likely to be sort of like with where you said with Lewis, like it's more important for him to be consistent with his feelings, sort of like as a sort of a thread, rather than in the moment.
When it's really one of those important kind of line the same things, and that I've read about ISFPs in general, like in several descriptions where they've talked about like sort of the if you cross a certain moral line with them, but they can seem extremely laid back and like they don't really have strong opinions about stuff a lot of the time. And then if you cross one of those things, then all of a sudden they're like turn into very fierce.
Oh yeah, because they've got that, and then they go, I sort of like to use that metaphor of the cat that's all like smooth, and then it like bares its claws, and it's like, because usually they're the accommodator, the behind the scenes interaction style, but yeah, they've got that.
A different show, obviously, but another one from not too long before Homicide, the show China Beach, about the Vietnam War, where it's an ensemble cast, but I'd say probably would be considered the main character. McMurphy, the nurse, is an ISFP also, and you see her kind of going back and forth on a lot of those things, like she wants to sort of stand for something, and she gets upset with herself for like not being more consistent. So she critiques herself or criticizes herself more than anybody else, but she also sort of has these kind of having a little bit of a tantrum moments with other people because she sort of projects her own insecurities. But yeah, it's sort of like certain things cross the line with her, and then she gets upset about stuff, and then some people are kind of like, hey, aren't you the happy party girl? Why are you getting so upset? But she kind of goes back and forth. She spends a lot of time sort of moping around, and then other times that she's much more like, hey, let's do whatever and party, because she tries to project not caring.
Right. So I'll just read through this so that rather than just like sat here, performers do quite well when life is easy for them, and they don't let themselves get too caught up in what they call sticky situations. Their tolerance for anxiety is the lowest of all the types, and they will avoid worries and troubles by ignoring the unhappiness of a situation as long as possible. Do you think that's true? Because
it kind of was what I said about now I'm going blank on repeat that again.
Okay, I was just do you think it's true that ESFPs really do have the lowest tolerance of anxiety for all of the types? Because I wouldn't say that's the case. Like, you have the ability to like get over stuff. And
I think what he means is like they don't want to like wallow in it,
right?
So it's not as much tolerance. I mean, I guess you could put it that way, but it's more like, why are we going to sit around like worrying about stuff? Let's go do something. Kind of the attitude, and so that kind of comes off to people as ignoring like serious things. But it's more like we don't feel like there's a reason to dwell on it unless we can actually do something about it.
Right. That's a little bit like Enneagram 7, where it's like this sort of like reframe things, sweep stuff under the rug, look on the bright side. As it says there, always look on the bright side. Always look on the bright side is their motto. And if forced to endure a tense, complicated situation, at work, for example, in a love relationship, they'll not make waves or put up a show of resistance. They will let themselves appear outwardly concerned, and then go their own way to do what they enjoy. So you can sort of see there, like the interaction style thing of not make waves. Do you relate to that? Because I know you got a 9 in your tri-type. Copyright Catherine Farber. I've got to say that every time I mention the word.
The word tri-type?
Yeah.
Oh.
Copyright Catherine Farber. That's why all the videos were taken down on the channel with TriType. Copyright Cup Father. They will appear.
Oh, why? Because you didn't put it in the title? Is that what you mean?
No, I did. It's just like it again. It's just taken down for legal reasons.
All right. Well, anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, specifically as far as Pembleton goes, kind of goes back to what I said about sometimes he'll put on a little bit of a show about caring about something and then not really. So that aspect of it, appear outwardly concerned and then go their own way, is kind of how he operates.
Yeah.
So it's tough to tell, and that's what we can go through all this, and I can kind of hear somebody of another type kind of being like, well, how can we know then what you really care about? And that's tough to answer. I actually talked to Crystal about that once, Lady Lullaby, in a video, because she was talking about interactions she saw between what she described as FI people versus FE people or whatever. And I said, and she said, I can see there's this conflict, but I don't really understand, what the FI person is feeling or whatever. And I said, here's the dirty little secret. The FI people don't know either.
That's the thing, especially if they're with artisans, it's like, that might be what they genuinely felt and was true in the moment, but they've moved on. Or it's just a different.
Yeah, it's really tough to like categorize it. That's why, again, why I sort of, I tend to reject those people that are so confident in these declarations that this exact specific behavior they can definitely quantify as this function in all situations. Like they break everything down and they say, oh, we know this and this. And I'm just like, you really don't. Like, because if the person themselves can't even tell you for sure whether something was sort of a genuine expression of emotion or if it was just something that sort of felt like doing, then if the person themselves doesn't even know, how is somebody else supposed to know that?
Frequently I talk about FE and FI can get to the same result via a different mechanism. So it's like someone can say, like if you it's like socionics would say, all relationships is FI. Which is, like I said, like you can't just easily put a tag on a certain thing and say
it's not that simple.
Yeah, and whereas I can sort of see it like both ways. So for example, just a slight digression, folks. Like so, for example, somebody can moderate their relationships by. It's like in Seinfeld where they would talk about the etiquette of like dates and breaking up and things like that. Like what is the done thing? Like what is a socially acceptable thing? And it's like, so you could say you could moderate relationships by like a by the book approach of like social norms, and then also going on a sort of a gut level of what you like instinctively sort of feel in turn. It's like, and you can get to the same behavior for like via different routes, and there's a bit of guesswork going on there, and you would need to, and the only way to really find out, and even then you're not really finding out, would be to have sort of like ask follow-up questions and have a sort of in-depth conversation about what makes this person tick. And even then there might be the sort of person who has like a sort of persona, and if you know them long enough, because certain people are like easier to classify than others. It's like, okay, this person is like, yeah, they're a cookie cutter ISTJ, or this other person, this person's hard to figure out. And it's like, there seems to be like a mixture of a few types. And it's almost like you got to sort of like put your ego to one side. And it's like, okay, this person's not easily categorizable. And whereas this other, and so some people are really like a particular type. So I say resemble. So it's like that guy Franklin, the minister. I would say like he like really resembles like ISTJ. And there are certain people who are like very much like this. Then there's other people who are just like tricky. And it's like when you found out more about them, it might be like a weird combination of Enneagram, some backstory things, and it just makes the person more interesting. They don't have to be neatly fit into a box and act exactly the way that type acts like in that box. But usually what we can, because the roles that people perform. And as Dario Nardi has shown, the roles that people perform change the brain. It's like, so for example, if Dario were to do an EEG of you, Jeff, he might say, "Oh, that bit of Jeff's brain looks like ISTJ," and it's that's because of the job. Just the little things like that.
Yeah, well, to give credit to him, I've never heard him actually say something like that. I don't think he characterizes things that.
Not that bluntly, but what he would say though is that certain jobs leave their mark on the in the mind. So, say if you were doing, say, lots of procedural stuff, say over 20 years,
well,
your preference that would sort of show up in the wiring.
It would be interesting to see because what the pattern showed, because it would be like, as time went on over the years, is my brain less active in those areas in terms of the things that just became the stuff that I got used to doing just as routine?
It just gets more efficient.
Because it doesn't require as much brain power.
Because it's like it's easy. It's that stuff that it's literally like you can almost correlate it to like how much the task gives you a headache as to like how much mental effort you're putting into it. Whereas you can do stuff that other people might that where it's like, oh, okay, this used to give me such a headache. This used to require so much concentration, but now you can sort of do it easily. And so the brain is only sort of really, with the EEG, will sort of pick up how much mental effort you're putting in. And if you become very efficient at something, it looks like there's not a lot of effort going in, but that's because you become efficient at it. Make it look easy to a certain extent. But yeah, I mean, Dario did say like 50% of the brain activity is like culture, education, career. And the other 50% related to type, and even then it's just patterns. Okay. What about this one, Jeff? Are you watching something, Jeff?
No, but I am getting a little tired. I'm hungry. I guess we never got to the showing the other pictures. It probably would take too long, but.
Yeah, it was like, so what about this? We'll try and whiz through this. Like ESFP is the most generous of all the types, second only to ISFPs in kindness. We saw that to a certain extent with that young boy, like giving him his phone number and saying that you can call me anytime. When he's in prison. They haven't got a stingy bone in their body. What's theirs is yours, and they seem to have.
Yeah, I think we don't see a ton of that from Frank, but I think there's some. I mean, he does, sort of share things with Bayless and stuff at times. He doesn't. I wouldn't say he's necessarily always open about doing that, but he's not stingy. Like he doesn't say, "Oh, I'm not." His reluctance, because I think Bayless picks on him about he didn't invite him over early enough. Like he wanted to come over sooner, but he doesn't say it's because he didn't want to share with him. He just he had other reasons anyway.
Yeah, there's also that thing where I think he said in the first episode that he wanted to work on his own, that he didn't want a partner.
Yeah, I think he felt like I think he expressed that he'd been let down by a lot of other people, and he felt like if he kind of opened up and allowed someone into his life, that he was opening himself up for hurt and betrayal and things like that. The part about giving what they have without expectation of reward, I think is true about him too, because I don't remember him ever saying anything about anyone owing him anything. He never sort of approaches things that way. Whereas it's sort of a contrast with the Guardians kind of having the ledger, as they say, in terms of people owe me a favor or I owe them something or they did this. So holding things over somebody is not something SPs tend to do. Like they'll use something to, as a tactic to get something, but it's not the kind of like tally of this person owes me kind of attitude.
Yeah, I would say that he can appear fickle. unable to hide their feelings nor hold their tongue. I think that's true. Usually emotionally expressive to an end.
As long as he's paying attention.
Yeah, and usually it's emotionally expressive to the end of a performance, or if it's in the moment and he's feeling a particular ethical thing. Right. Any more comments on paragraph 7?
No.
All right, number 8. Although they are often popular with their classmates because of their good-hearted clowning and cutting up, performers are not deeply interested in school nor scholastic pursuits, caring little about preparation, schedules, or grades. Unlike the ISTPs, ESFPs are not usually hostile to their teachers.
I would say it's likely, even though we don't see it, and there's not a lot said about it, that Pembleton probably did cut up some in class, and he had some interest in learning about things. He obviously retained some information, but what's usual with artisans is we don't like to learn in the way that we're often taught, where things become very boring and kind of routinized. We want to explore the things we think are interesting and not be held down by curricula and tests and that sort of thing. More independent.
Practical things. Yeah, there's nothing really in that paragraph there that we can talk about Frank, because all we really know is that he was taught by the Jesuits.
Yeah,
and he retained enough that he could read Greek.
Yeah, and it's like I've said about my childhood. There were things that sort of sparked an interest where I then pursued it on my own to learn more about it. It wasn't because it was a teacher that was like, oh, you need to read more about this particular thing. In fact, the more that a teacher said something was important, the less I wanted to do it. Because, again, it's that attitude of you don't want to be told what to do.
Yeah, and again, in the limelight, although there was that bit where, his attitude, wasn't there a couple of instances where he didn't enjoy being on TV that much, Frank?
I don't know. I think even that was sort of like, he didn't feel like he was in control of the situation. It wasn't in his element, so he didn't like the way that it was. But again, sometimes it's hard to tell.
Oh, is that the thing that you've talked about with artisans, where it's like they can have a skill, but they only want to show it when they've really mastered it?
Yeah, or just don't feel like you're in the element where you can really do it to your best ability. So you don't like to come off, like to have a bad performance because you're not, in the right frame of mind or whatever it is you have to be in to do it.
Right. Performance excitement and being on stage. Well, we could say that the boxes is stage. Sociability, adaptability. Right. Yeah, you could say he's sensitive to the pain and suffering of others. Yeah. I'm not really seeing him with children. Then this is the final paragraph. Yeah, unpredictable. Yeah, in some ways. Yeah, you see that one there, going to the behaviour. ESFPs are happiest when the home is filled with people having a good time. We don't really get that impression with Frank, but we don't know his circle.
Yeah, and I don't know how often he's had the opportunity to do that. As like we talked about before, when I talked about my 18th birthday party, where I felt like there were people there, but nobody was really paying attention to me, so it was kind of empty feeling. So I don't know, obviously, the circumstances, since as far as Pembleton goes, we only know what they show us of the character, so we don't have a lot of examples to go on that.
I remember something in the series. Remember when Frank was sort of laid off? He was sort of maybe suspended, and he was at home, and he was sort of driving his wife crazy because he was doing cooking and making a mess of it. So he was having to sort of stay active. And so that sort of, maybe we could say that this was a guy who had like a hard time relaxing, and that he needed the challenge of something.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Right then, there was that. All the slides that are there. I'll put this on for the audience, but I won't go through it. I'm just gonna put it on screen, and people can pause the video when they want to. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What are you counting down for?
Well, I don't know. There's just something to say.
Okay.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There you go. If people want to read it, well, we've actually done 8 events going through this profile. So, you know, hardly anybody watches it, even though it's got Jeff in it, and they flipping well should do, in my opinion. Should. It just doesn't get found, but there we go. So I think we've...
Well, once I become super famous, Ben, then all these videos will get so much more attention. It's funny, though, because I think we talked about before, there was somebody that was pretty famous. Was it Matthew McConaughey? I think it might have been him, where he had his own YouTube channel, and it had like a really small number of views and subscribers because he just did absolutely nothing to promote it. So it's like most people didn't even realize it existed. So it is possible for somebody who's actually famous to not get any attention to their videos, but if they do anything to actually draw attention to it, then it'll probably blow up pretty fast.
Yeah. Right then. So that's Frank Pembleton. So who do you think we should cover next?
Well, first of all, I'd say that I probably should have watched more Homicide for this to be fresh in my mind, because it's been a while, even though I've watched some clips recently, but I haven't watched the actual show in a while. So if we had done this a little bit closer to when we stopped the reviews, I probably would have had a little bit more insight. But the time just goes anyway, and there's so many things we can talk about. So
yeah, I mean, I had this, you know, I thought about doing this for a few years, like this, because we did Giardella, and I thought, oh, let's do, but you weren't in the mood for that. And
but the bottom line is that, like I said, I relate a lot to the character Pembleton, and my contention is that ESFP is his best fit type for the many reasons we've gone into. And I think he's an example of that I try to point out, as Ben says, I think even in the title of this video, that he doesn't fit some of the stereotypes of ESFP as being like some sort of party frat guy or something, you know, that someone can still be a thoughtful person, an effective person, you know, intelligent, and you know, in a job that's viewed as important as an ESFP, and that the ESFP preferences play out differently in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different areas. And you know, yes, there are some jobs where probably an ESFP is not going to be very well suited for it. They're going to have to work very hard or learn a hell of a lot that's kind of against their instinct to do it well. But there's a lot of jobs where we can sort of adapt to the circumstances as they are, and sort of make it our own. And even though my job is not as important as a police detective in terms of, at the end of the day, you know, it's nobody's being put away for crimes in my job, but it's similar in the sense that I sort of have a by-the-book type situation where I have to kind of find the ways to make it interesting and fun for me to do, to be able to keep going at it. So I recommend to everybody, if you haven't already, to watch the show Homicide: Life on the Street. By all means, start at the beginning with the episode Gone for Good, and get to know Frank and all the characters. And as far as who to do next, you know, I said before, I think, no guarantee, of course, but I think probably the character that might get the most attention or views would be Munch, because he's the character that's gone across other programs. And so even people that have never seen Homicide have seen Munch and know of him. So I would say that would probably be a good one to do. But obviously I can talk about any of them, Bayless or Lewis or, you know, Kellerman, or, you know, it's funny because I don't know if he'd ever be willing to do it, but I feel like if we do a Kellerman one, I would want to have Morgan in that one, just because it's fun to actually be able to talk about their similarities and differences, and he has strong opinions on what they did to the characters. So.
Yeah, because I think Munch would be a good one to do next, because we've already we talked already a little bit just in passing about Lewis, and we feel like we're repeating ourselves.
Yeah, with Munch, it'd be a nice change of pace because the rarity of an intuitive character on the show, and some of the people you might find more of the people that are into typology that would have more insights on that too, as well as some more people that have seen him on SVU or even other shows.
I think it would be unlikely that we did. What was he called? Brody, the one that was Max Ehrlich played.
Yeah, that would probably be the shortest one, I would guess. It would be, it might be fun sometime, because the one that I think we agreed was the hardest to type was actually Ballard, because and there were a couple other ones like Shepard and G's son, that we weren't quite agreed on either, because they just weren't as well established. But
yeah, they weren't as well written, and also with Ballard. Yeah, and there was also one, Stivers. Was she called Stivers? Like, she had a really strong start, really like feisty, like with Lewis, and then like she just becomes almost a complete character change. Like,
well, I don't think so, and I may have said at the time that I think she's another example of an ISFP, which I think is why she both gets along with and clashes so much with Lewis. Because when you have people of the same type like that, they kind of bring out the best and worst in each other. And I think that's what happens with them, is that, and we talked about the lines in the sand, that the whole thing with Mahoney shooting basically became that thing for her where she was obsessed with it in a different way than Lewis was. They both were kind of obsessed with it in different ways.
Yeah, and I think it was for plot reasons that they had her sort of like waver in order to eventually sort of nail.
Yeah, but I think it was consistent with her character in the sense that just because she was a kind of a tough, feisty character didn't mean that she couldn't have sort of a moral dilemma. And right from the beginning, you can tell that she wasn't happy with what Kellerman did, but under the circumstances, she didn't see an immediate way to do anything about it. But over time, she couldn't let it go. And I don't necessarily think that it was guilt, although it's possible. I don't know how it would be characterized by the writers. I don't believe they ever actually said that. But I also don't think it was any attempt on her part that she felt like she had to bring down Kellerman. I don't think she hated him in any way. But I think she felt like her own personal integrity was threatened by the whole situation. And so she couldn't just let it go.
Yeah. Anyhow, we can wind up now, because we've decided to not talk about Frank.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody. And whoever we decide to do next, you can join us for that.
Probably be Munch. We try and pull out all the stops and